My name is Pepita Elena McKee. I am CEO and founder of Impact Resolutions, and I'm a sociologist and anthropologist by trade. So the work that really drives me, or I feel gives me purpose, is working with people and being able to share their stories in a way that is co-collaborated and informs things that might affect them. So that's mainly the work that I do now.
Amazing. Could you tell us a little bit about the work you do? I think if you are trying to understand this topic, I think it's a little bit intimidating for people. I think that it plays an important role, and perhaps it's a role that people don't get to see that often because it is important to have someone kind of as an intermediary, being able to build bridges along both sides. And I think that highlighting your work is so valuable because we can all perhaps learn from building bridges between two sides. And I think as we might disagree more with people, not able to see their opinion or their viewpoints, it's important to try and understand. It's trying to build those connections. So could you tell us perhaps about the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. As a sociologist and anthropologist, that was later in my career. I think very early, it was really important for me to live with communities and to live with people and really understand their day-to-day as a way to understand how policies are implemented in practice. So I have a real discomfort reading something and signing off on something without having a first-hand knowledge or a real clear picture around how information was collected, who it was collected from, and ensuring that it's not only elected leadership or those who hold sort of authoritative positions, but grandma and grandpa, the youth, the elders, the aunties and uncles, how were they included? And were they provided a safe space to share their stories in a way that they felt comfortable?
Right.
Yeah.
Could you give us like an example of when you come in? What does it sort of look like? You have perhaps a big industry trying to work with a community. What does it sort of look like for you to be brought into a circumstance?
I've been pretty lucky in terms of where I'm brought in. Earlier in my career, I worked mostly internationally and had been given this really unique opportunity to live with communities who were involuntarily resettled by a large dam. And this is 7 years after construction. The proponent or the client still required monitoring and evaluation to ensure the agreements at time of construction or resettlement were still being followed through. And this is a context where, going back, I had developed a real, she's my mentor now, and, she really loved the approach that I take to live with communities as a way to understand how policies are implemented in practice, and had convinced her client that you should hire myself. Because they were having a real problem understanding, well, on paper, everything looked great. But as an example of my approach or my method in this context was to live with them. And these were two communities, and close to 7,000 people were relocated involuntarily. And these two communities in particular had really protested against the construction of the dam. And as they were going ahead anyway, had decided to agree to negotiations, a memorandum of understanding, and a resettlement action plan. So this is 7 years after. And, they were relocated. And unbeknownst to me, there were still a lot of struggles, and that came out with community members shooting at proponents like myself. So I didn't know that at the time. I had been given the opportunity to live with them. And, I was early in my career, and it was really important for me to live with them, but also to earn their trust. So it was, I was given that opportunity to develop a meaningful relationship by demonstrating that I'm here not just to parachute in. And I think that's a really important component. People need to see there's some investment. I'm not just coming in and leaving, which often is the case. You're going in for a meeting and then they leave. And here my offer or my proposal, and this is something they've never done before, was to live with them. So my first year, and I ended up there close to 6 years, was only for a couple months. But it was important in that 2 months to have permission to come back. So, that experience really gave me an insight into what's important, especially when you're dealing with large-scale involuntary resettlement or large-scale impacts due to development of infrastructure. So it gave me the insight that I'm on the right path, and I was able to learn really quickly where things had gone sideways.
Interesting. So these corporations we're working with an Indigenous or a Native population to the area, and maybe we're not getting what we need, maybe we're not getting the agreements that we were hoping for, and then they call you or they call an organization to come in and sort of be an intermediary between the two. Is this a new approach?
Yeah, I think, and this was a special case. That experience, usually I'm hired when they're in the environmental assessment application process, and internationally, especially when involuntary resettlement is involved, there's great effort to really understand and scope a cross-section of the community. So it's at least the effort is there. And that's after doing it wrong for many, many years. They've established these international guidelines, whether they're operating under World Bank involuntary resettlement guidelines or International Finance Corporation performance standards. There are requirements that are involved with bilateral loaning.
Right.
And sort of applications for funding. And so that international experience gave me the breadth of understanding of what pre-construction, pre-sort of agreements, what was involved in terms of moving towards consent, ensuring or the bank being happy with the way the proponent may have collected that information, understood impacts for either avoiding or mitigating or compensating for any negative consequences.
Wow. So when they contact you, are you agreeing you moved there for 2 months at first. What is that agreement like? Like, what is the expectations of you? Is it just to go kind of live a day in the life and understand, or are you gathering what does that sort of experience look like, or that agreement, at least on the side of the corporation?
Well, it was and I think a really unique circumstance, because Dr. Helen Cruz, who had essentially recruited me on a project she was already working on, and this was before I'd completed my BA. So I was still in school at this time and, was really thinking about what my next steps might be, and had discovered with some of my early work in BC, the importance of living with these communities. And a lot of the information was being able to identify you had spoken to this person who you thought was your broker. But in reality, that person actually doesn't live in the communities. So really just trying to pivot and work with the Indigenous peoples organization that was created, who were supposed to represent community members and strengthen that relationship, at least that communication between the proponent, the dam proponent people, and the Indigenous peoples organization, who were representative of the wider community. And it was through that, developing that, I guess, those relationships, living with these communities really day to day. And these are areas which sadly you would expect their living situations to be better than maybe before they were resettled, with no running water, no electricity. And in one community that was relocated to the top of a mountain, potentially in 5 to 10 years with no source of water because of where they were. So there were some things that were coming ahead that were outside of the control of the dam, but for the community themselves were, of great concern.
Right. And what is it like to build relationships with the community? When you're heading in, do you have a mindset, a approach on who you'd like to connect with first, to build perhaps stronger relationships, perhaps knowing that in a certain community, elders are really important. So building connections with them first will perhaps pay dividends in being able to build relationships with other people. How do you go about approaching that?
In this case, it was already predetermined for me, and the community were really open and enthusiastic about welcoming me in. In other circumstances, when it's involved in an environmental assessment application or impact assessment, it really is about each community will have different protocols, and ensuring that I'm respecting local context. So it would be, well, who should I talk to? And usually that, if it's here in Canada, it would be a call to the band office, understanding, do you have a protocol officer? And then working with that protocol officer, understanding, well, this is sort of the plans, and then working through talking to the right people. When I was working in central BC in the Wet'suwet'en territory, I was coming on with the proponent already supposedly having established relationships. And, in a similar way, it's about developing that relationship with those that we were delegated to or who were delegated to working with me. And then, in my way, it's about giving as much as you're taking. So being able to demonstrate that I'm really here to listen and to share, and certainly whether that's here in Canada or working internationally, you're tested. How how authentic are you really, right? And I think that takes some time. In Canada, I was lucky because when I was thrown into projects or placed onto project, there wasn't much expectation for me to do much. Internationally, though, my work has been different. I've been really blessed to work with some really great proponents who want to do the best possible effort in order to collect the right information. So it really depends on the client. And it depends on the political will or maybe the pressure for a financial investment decision on whether that project might go ahead. In that first case that I was talking about, that's a project that's already been built, and they were looking for ongoing funding. So, I'd love to say these people want to do the right thing or these companies want to do the right thing, but really there's some political will or sort of tension behind it that they have to do that kind of work. So I've been, again, really blessed to kind of sit in that context where people need my skills. And that is, as a social scientist, to be able to collect a lot of qualitative information in a very short period of time and then quantify it into themes or concepts that, lawyers and accountants and, business developers will understand. And that really is the role that, I didn't think, as a young person, never thought that's what I want to be, but that's what I've been able to really flourish in.
Yeah, it's like you're like a community translator for the needs and the desires and the aspirations of that community into what lawyers, accountants, and financial workers and these people are able, the language they speak, the numbers that they're looking at in terms of what do they need, how much funding do we allocate to X, Y, and Z. I'm just interested to know, because it seems like you're perhaps one of the only people trying to balance that scale. We hear about inequities when corporations are dealing with vulnerable communities that don't have, even thinking of my community, they don't have an expert financial person to look at potential agreements. And then some people might argue, well, any opportunity would be fantastic for them because they don't have any right now.
That's right.
But once they take on that agreement, then they're not open to any other agreements. And so perhaps the next proponent would have been been more kind or generous or more supportive. And so when you're in a business situation, you're kind of going, this is what we're willing to give up. This is what we'll give them if they ask for it. But if they don't ask for it, we're not going to give anything. And so there is a difference in relationship because often the communities have no idea what they should be asking for, what questions they should ask. And if they're not in that position, they won't know to ask for those things. And you're kind of sent in to kind of evaluate what should they be asking for. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that was certainly much the case 2006, 2007. And in BC, I can speak to, and I'm really thinking around, the regulatory environment on what a proponent or an industry or a government is supposed to do. Internationally, that conversation, I love the way you frame it. You're right. This is the needs of an industry or a government who needs information to pass X, Y, and Z. But this might be the first time a community has even had to think about these things. And so how do you contend with that? And, I find it's really trying to push the timeline on the needs of, that industry proponent or government proponent with the reality of communities. They, there's a whole life that they're living that is not following their timeline. And that's kind of the pressure between the two. And again, if you have a strong regulatory environment requiring you to do meaningful engagement, then, for the proponent, they're going to build that into their operational plans and their budgets. And that makes it easier for someone like me to, being able to build a business case in terms of why we need to spend some time in communities versus a regulatory environment that really looks to validate what the community is saying to you quite late in the stages of an environmental application process. Well, if the industry is not required to do that, then they've done just enough. And that's where you see the tensions and I think changes in the regulatory environment in Canada, which is really exciting. What seems to be, I was really surprised working internationally and coming back here to Canada, how much I took for granted of what it took to do an impact assessment. And, I'll just give you one example. And I was so impressed. I was working for a potential hydro project that was going to involuntarily relocate 13 communities in the Prairie River Delta in a very remote region of Papua New Guinea. And the CEO had just, there was a requirement, but he went above and beyond that to develop, in addition to the work that the impact assessment team were, attempting to do. He developed a third-party auditor made up of Oxfam and other NGOs to audit the work that we were doing. But he would go ahead in advance of our team who spent months there to collect this information in terms of what their lives were like now to ensure that all the right people were there. So it really depends on, the regulatory environment, the sort of the hindsight of a CEO to understand that doing all this really meaningful engagement up front will sort of develop the right mechanisms for successful construction and operations. It's rare, but I feel very lucky to have worked with a few people like that.
That's really interesting that you say that, because it's how I felt about being a Native court worker, was just that there were these amazing people doing such good work, but we don't put them on the front page of a newspaper.
No.
They don't really get the credit of the impact that they're trying to have, or the everyday, like there were some Crown Council that would call me and say, we have a client in cells, we need you to go see them, like we want you to help them, try and get them connected with treatment. Nobody's talking about that. And then we talk about systemic racism, or we talk about the evils of the criminal justice system, and we don't talk about the good work. And I think the thing that I experienced was there was such a sense of perhaps discouragement of doing good work, because no matter how hard you try, that's not going to make the news. It's going to be that one case where somebody did do something wrong that interests everybody. And it's not those good, kind leaders who aren't looking for the fame or recognition for it.
Yeah, it's troubling because, in my career as it's evolved, I know sort of where my heart sits. And again, it was just pure luck that I'm working with, CEOs like I did in Papua New Guinea or in other projects in Western Australia, and even in this dam project, who knew it. Sorry, in the Philippines, who understood that they weren't getting the right information and were willing to take a leap to do something different with me, and and then work. It's a whole group of people, it's a community of people doing these things. And I think people don't generally want to do bad things, but they aren't given the space to do good things. And so it's pressure for them just to produce on a timeline that is so unreasonable because ultimately it wasn't scoped well. So that I feel like that's kind of been my charge, is to ensure that whatever the project, however big or small, the upfront work to scope it well and be able to properly, place a budget, which within each line item, if you will really make a difference for people to do either good work or bad work. And or, does it sort of nurture that culture of competition, which is, and bullying and harassment, because, if scoped well, people won't feel like they're, that they'll have the time and that all the work and the work that they're doing has some meaning in terms of the greater goal of whatever that is.
So you're like saying that if you're in Vancouver during rush hour traffic, you're going to make worse decisions in terms of your ability to you have to get somewhere by 5 p.m. and it's 4:48 and you're rushing through.
I'm guilty of that. Done it.
Yeah.
I've made, made bad decisions because I felt rushed.
Yeah.
And if you remove or create space not to feel like you're going to make a bad decision or put yourself in a high-risk situation. And I think that's for most parts of our lives, is really to humanize it. Yeah. And I think some companies do that really well, and they're learning on that it's more than the engineering aspects of a project. There are non-engineering or non-technical aspects of a project that are equally important that could create a sort of the life cycle in a really healthy way of that project.
That's interesting. I've never really thought about that. So would that be something, if you could wave a magic wand and change one aspect of this industry and the relationships, it would be to flesh out and make sure that you have a better sense of what the process is going to be and have better expectations, so that those everyday employees who are looking to go up the corporate ladder and be put in as management and then climb that they're not incentivized to be bad actors, because then they have the time to go, okay, let's make sure that everything makes sense here and we're happy.
Or you're having the right people in the right places to do the right work. You're not just building an organization based on nothing or just assumptions. If it's evidence-based, you're going to have a better idea of having the right people in the room to do the right work. I think that's one aspect. And I don't think that's going to solve everything, because I think people have a lot of, in terms of how we work with each other, we need to practice that more in terms of creating a more human place to work. But I think we can remove a lot of the tensions that create or sort of foster negative behavior. And then I think there's another component where, and I feel really grateful to be involved in the Indigenous Centre for Cumulative Effects, which is it's a national organization, a nonprofit that understanding cumulative effects and all that happens in our community, we're trying to develop the conversation that those conversations about development aren't triggered by development. That we're giving communities, or we hope that we're giving communities an opportunity to develop their own understanding of what is valuable, from a sort of a whole centered approach. And then if a community or developer comes, they already have that information. They've been working on it. They've already been practicing that conversation and know where their boundaries are and who's sort of set up to speak with the right people, who needs to be consulted with, because that's it. And I can say really easily, when I first came back to Canada, the understanding of who should we talk to, especially in a hereditary elected system in most communities, was not only confusing for proponents, but also for community members. And that's sort of the work that we're trying to do at that national level, is give, that opportunity, we hope, or at least that's what we started with, regardless of what's happening out there, what they need, what do you need? And let's start that conversation with the elders, with the youth, because that's really the people who should be driving these conversations, or those members who live in those communities.
That's so interesting. I'm writing a paper on First Nations economic development, and community consultation was not something I expected to be the cornerstone of my paper, but developing community plans, economic plans. It sounds like that's what you're talking about as well, is having an understanding of what does community mean, where do we want to see ourselves? Because one of the problems you can have is you bring in a great development, but then none of the community members saw them doing the jobs that the organization was offering and saying like, oh, we're going to give you pipeline jobs. And then the community's like, I don't want that job.
That's right. That might not be for them, or being able to say yes or no to opportunities because it came from them first, but not to forget the religious and spiritual component of that. And that's one thing, of a practitioner where, you see development go really sideways, is not taking really, that human heart-centered approach, that it's more than the economics that makes up our well-being or our whole selves. It's more than, housing. It's sort of our spiritual time. That as well. And I think that's what's really exciting about a cumulative effects approach. It sort of helps, I think, for me to understand potentially who are the right people to talk to, right? Who are the real decision makers? Because we know it's not always those who are elected, or even those who claim to be hereditary or who are hereditary, right? There's other people in those communities that are influential and for other reasons outside of economic ones.
Interesting. So the spiritual and perhaps the wellness side is likely the religious elements are going to be the hardest for a corporation to quantify, to understand. And when I had Keith Carlson on and Sunny McKelsey, and they are very interested in Indigenous locations here in the Fraser Valley and place names.
Yes.
One of the comments they've made is that we've destroyed some sacred spots for Indigenous people here by putting in pipelines, getting rid of burial grounds, just kind of running them over. And then their comment was kind of like, well, you wouldn't tear down the Eiffel Tower to put a pipeline through it.
Absolutely.
And so could you share?
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's exciting because, again, I just assumed this was done everywhere. And in involuntary resettlement context, it's about understanding your sense of place for those reasons that you just identified. Graveyard sites, spiritual sites, sacred site. It's really about understanding a sense of place and understanding for that community in an involuntary resettlement context how far that sense of place goes. Because if you're relocating a whole home, a whole community, then that needs to be identified. And in order to either avoid those spaces or be able to properly compensate it. So the method or the approach it's really in the process versus the outcome. You're creating that safe space for those members to feel safe to share with you. And then you're validating the information that you're interpreting to make sure that, well, did I get that right? But at the same time, impressing upon the people, I'm taking this information because it could mean something, and it could mean something really great. It could mean something really horrible. But whatever that choice is, I want it. So it's really a sharing of information in terms of what engagement and consultation looks like. So for me, it's like understanding a sense of place, which in impact assessment work, I think it's more and more acceptable because it gives you that greater sense outside of just the cost of living. Those socioeconomic aspects.
Do you feel like that's the hardest part to portray? Because even for me, I get like, there's the woo woo. Like I struggle with that in my own
I've been
life.
told, well, we all need a socialist in the room. I never thought of myself as one, but that's how maybe a client would see me, because I feel that's where I really shine. And I didn't really discover that about myself, that I'm really good at taking those really complicated concepts and being able to quantify them really quickly. And that's where I went back to school to do graduate work, was really to sort of hone those skills further. So after working internationally, I decided to pursue graduate work, which, again, I was going in with purpose. I was like, okay, I know, I want to make socioeconomic impact assessments or impact assessments easy for people. That was kind of my mission. And I was very fortunate to have, been trained through a medical sociological anthropological lens, which takes emergent information and then focus on quantifying that information. So whether it's on a sort of a small scale or through a large sort of national data set, that was all what I did with my graduate work in that regard. So for me, it's pretty easy. and again, but it really goes down to creating that space, ensuring you have the right people in the room, that people in the community have endorsed to be with you. So there's a whole approach before, in terms of consultation and engagement, this idea around moving towards consent. It does take a little bit of time, but once you get there, it's like zoom, it's like, you have that trust, you have that sort of permission from, the leadership, which, in my mind is a cross-section of people in that community, to work with them to develop that information that you need to understand what we would call a value component, to understand not only the relationship between people and environment, or people with things, or a sense of place, but all those things that might be required for a later regulatory application.
Right. One thing I feel like that often gets left out of the conversation is that these developments, in many circumstances, are beneficial to the community, as long as things are done, obviously, equitably, but that for many First Nations communities here in BC or Canada, we're facing severe amounts of poverty.
Yeah.
We have a lack of development based on where we've been located, the size of the reserves. All of these things have played a role in us not being able to develop well economically. Mm-hmm. And so this is a potential space for improvements, for communities to gain capacity and to feel confident in their own communities, and to be able to make sure that everybody's taken care of. So there is benefits.
There's an opportunity. There absolutely is. But I think where developers have made the mistake is around the timelines and the pressure that they need to sort of push forward, their timelines versus the communities. I think there's a real opportunity when there's a political will, and I've seen that, where negotiated well, you see a lot of benefits coming back into those communities that can be used for multiple purposes. And that's the thing, you're collecting, you would hope, and I think that's where a developer does really well. You're collecting information for your project, but it's also the community's information that they can use for multiple purposes. So I think there are opportunities and benefits that could be generated. And I've seen that when there's political will to do so, because of the client or the proponent who needs something, right? I think for those others, it hasn't been done well because it's really rushed. There's no validation of, is that the right person that you're actually talking to? And, however big or small that project might be, the benefits are really funneling into one person. And that's a problem, because that's what people remember in terms of development. And I think people wouldn't mind opportunities coming back to that community, but I believe, and I think it's becoming more commonplace, they should decide what those benefits are, and they should be included in those conversations.
Interesting. So for Canada, we're looking at UNDRIP, which is the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous
Peoples
People.
Act.
It's a long word.
And then BC's Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act as well, so DRIPA, which BC just came out with an action plan for implementation. And then, which is really exciting. I think when I first started this work in the 90s, even creating awareness that there were land claim issues was a big issue. And, even the idea around the horrible legacy of residential schools was not discussed. And so you see this, I think, in BC, a really unique situation, looking at that a majority of British Columbia hasn't been officially treated yet. There's a political will for the province to do this because, you look through sort of the Supreme Court cases that are on the side of rights and title. It would be in the province's best interest to really implement some of the, identified action items in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report, calls to justice. So, and then DRIPA just really formalizing that, well, in theory, to be mainstream throughout sort of all, I guess, civil approaches, civil projects. And
so do you have optimism? Because I've heard it on both sides. I've heard comments from professors go, we've had commissions done all since the 1900s, and we've had new commissions that say basically the same thing. Yeah. And today it's got a new name, it's got a flashy title, people are keeping it in mind, but that it hasn't really done that much, or that there's no teeth in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission requiring it to be implemented by X date or something along those lines. So do you feel like we're moving in the right direction? I know that in the last election, a big question was, are we going to bring in UNDRIP into our Canadian legislation? And then what does that mean for, I think it's consent, or there was a piece of it that was being discussed.
Free and prior informed consent.
Yes.
And that goes back to, the Calder case, which, you need to consult with, Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples. It's all kind of built on from that, considering that these efforts to negotiate, really, existed in 1887 and continues. So I think it's moving in the right direction. I do have a bit of spirit of optimism around it because as a practitioner, the more legislation that supports meaningful engagement, is the better. And I think the more and more practitioners that, and I think there are who are really hungry for the legislation to support the work that they want to do, right. Whether it's in government, whether it's in industry, we have something now to say, well, there's a business case. It's not a nice thing and a thing that we know will be the right thing to do, but you're required to do it now. So whatever that looks like, I think we're moving in the right directions. And now it's just sort of regulating that space. And I think in terms of, what meaningful engagement, what does that look like? And that's really not determined by me. But what is determined by the legislation is that time has to be scoped in for those activities.
Interesting. So the right-leaning perspective that I think Andrew Scheer tried to lay out was basically that you've got this pipeline that needs to go from A to B, and it's going to go through 15 different Indigenous communities. And if 14 of them are all on board and they all agree and they consent,
I'm done.
And then there's one. What do we do with that one? And so that's the question around free, prior, and informed consent.
Well, and I think it goes back to sure, you have that, but then it's not only what you have, it's how you got there.
Right.
So I think that's where FPIC has utility. It kind of provides us a bit of a diagnostic tool to sort of say, okay, well, we know what FPIC looks like, with all these other case studies across the globe. We know why FPIC exists. Well, how has it been applied here? So there'll be that, I think, an analysis on more than, you have those 11 elected band councils who agree to the project, But it's more than that. It's more about, and I think in BC, especially with rights and title, it's for those who live on and off reserve.
Interesting. Can you tell us, perhaps some of it is confidential, but would you be able to walk us through what happened with the Wet'suwet'en community? Just perhaps a historical layout of what went wrong, because I think that that's the Indigenous community that stands out the most. And as I'm working on this First Nations Economic Development Plan, many people believe that Indigenous people are actually anti-development. And I think that that's a consequence of how the Wet'suwet'en community is covered and how all the projects that go forward that are peaceful and there's no issues, they don't get covered. But when there is a disagreement, that's what makes the news of Indigenous people standing in the way and protesting. Yeah. So would you be able to perhaps share what you kind of saw play out?
Yeah, and I feel really grateful to continue to work in the territories and with people. And my approach has been, and, even the work that I've done in the Philippines and elsewhere internationally, I still have a connection with those people. So that's always been my approach. And when I first started there, I had inherited a project where my predecessor had been trying to develop relationships for a number of years and wasn't successful. And there's no blame on why that happened. So when I first, I guess, came on the scene, I was still using that hat of my international hat, which is, develop meaningful relationships. And I think, I feel really grateful for coming on to a project that had the political will to want to pass an environmental assessment application process. And that was coming up in the following year. So there was an interest, or at least I had the support of the project leadership to live with those communities, develop the relationships, and only because quite quickly in a matter of months, I was able to develop a relationship with those who lived on and off reserve quickly enough where we had a memorandum of understanding to do environmental work together. And my approach has always been, this environmental data collection doesn't mean that you consent to this project. It just means that you're auditing the work that we're doing, and whatever your decision, it's informed. And again, I thank goodness for that CEO in Papua New Guinea who taught me that. That's what's important here, that people understand that if this project goes ahead or if it doesn't, at least they're involved and they're included to be able to make that decision. So I felt really blessed again to have, and at the time, 10 of the 11 hereditary chiefs accompany us in the field to collect environmental information and understand that sense of place. But that was a lot of me living there, me developing the relationships, and again, it wasn't, I love that work. It's sort of like I could live with communities, share stories, but be really clear about why I'm using their information. I could have done that work for the rest of my life if that was, if I was allowed to do that. But in that short period of time, it was an intense couple of years because, and we were competing with 18 other industries who were looking to operate there. That included LNG and mining and forestry. So I felt really grateful to have the attention of the hereditary chiefs and the Office of the Wet'suwet'en. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't, it was an authentic, I felt, relationship where I could reach out and they could reach to me, and we had developed a relationship of trust. And I think the hard work wasn't with communities. It wasn't with the Wet'suwet'en people. It wasn't with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en. It was with my client or with the proposed proponent. And again, it's because they had an operational budget and a scope in mind and needs and a timeline that didn't match the reality of the communities. And so, and thank goodness I had the executive leadership on the team to support me and be able to sort of fend off the needs of the larger mothership who needed things, right? But that's why we were successful in getting our environmental application, because I was given that space to do the work and to live there and to, build a community office. And, when we did receive environmental application approval, I was told essentially they don't do that across the rest of the companies, so we won't be doing that anymore. So that was the context of that time and that work, because again, there was a political will and a desire to do what I thought was meaningful engagement in collaboration with community members, but it was because there was an environmental assessment application that needed approving at that time.
One question I have is, we often hear about this. The Wet'suwet'en is not in Vancouver. They're not in a busy area. How do we land on who
to talk to? Yeah.
Why do we go through these communities is often what I hear, that
Right.
we could develop the pipeline to go and avoid these communities. So how do we end up having that we need to go through this community and 17 different proposals on one community that's out it's not in a metropolis, it's not in a busy place?
I think it's changing. Again, you have a regulatory environment that collected years of biophysical and environmental and geotechnical data to understand what would be the best right-of-way through a territory that disconnected or didn't validate that information with the people who live there and who use the land until quite a bit later. And I think with the new regulatory environment in BC since 2018, 2019, and federally, that's changing, where you wouldn't collect 5 years of, that kind of information without really validating that with the people. That's all sort of turned upside down. So I think, those decisions on where people will build in that regulatory environment at that time weren't required to validate their plans with the people who live there. And that, those decisions on who they should talk to, in that regulatory context, it was only with the elected leadership. So that's, and with my work, it was really those who lived on and off reserve. It was a more of a hereditary approach versus because that's the way I was trained. You learned, in a voluntary resettlement context, not only those who have, sort of the authority, I guess, in air quotes there, but also who have the informal or the hereditary governance systems. Are those frameworks that operate within communities? And so my natural approach would be to understand that. And so that, again, that came quite late when, they had already been collecting 5 to 6 years of environmental information, and we're only kind of missing that piece in that territory.
Interesting. So were you still working with the community? I know you still have relationships there, but when I want to call it like a debacle with the Wet'suwet'en, it sounds like ties were cut, issues were created, and then it sort of started to make international headlines. What did you see play out, or what was the circumstance of you watching that kind of come
unfold? With NDAs, I can't speak too much. In too much detail. I was sitting, this is probably post 2016, and I think with EthPIC, kind of going back to that, it is, you're developing meaningful consultation engagement, not just for when you need it, but for a life cycle. And I'm not sure if the same method or approach was kept up. I'd say I'm not confident after they won environmental application approval. So that, I think, changes the dynamic, and you lose those relationships when, that method or momentum isn't being kept up. And I think that's for most companies, not in that particular context. But what might have amplified distrust, or maybe sort of that, I would say, protest against, what was happening, was able to flourish because of, in a sense, an abandonment, right? Because they don't, that group, while it gained international attention, there was a large majority who didn't have a voice, or who weren't talking, and rightly so. They, whether they were agreeing to the, sort of what was happening, or not agreeing to it, there was this big middle who, really have lives to live, want to, I'm sure, take advantage of opportunities that were happening in their community, and were involved in. So there was many, I guess, sides to that equation. That the one that got the international attention were the protesters, of course, and that only escalated. And very well organized. It was quite an impressive campaign, and continues to be today. I think what worries me, still continuing to work in that territory, is around, regardless of what their opinion is, that's kind of besides the point, is it a safe space for people in that territory now? And I would say no, it's not. People aren't able to enjoy their territory in the way that they did to all these developments in the territory, because of these tensions and these conflicts that haven't been addressed.
Right. The one part I'd like your thoughts on, because I don't have a well fleshed out viewpoint, but it worries me when you have protesters coming from communities that are completely disconnected, going all the way up to a community, and then picking a side, and they're not consulting.
And that's it, right? It should be the same approach and same lens should be applied evenly, equitably. And that's what it was. When I say we had the hereditary chiefs with us in the field, it was really, eye-opening for protesters from California telling the hereditary chief of that territory to get off First Nations land, and having that hereditary chief say, well, actually, we've given them permission to collect environmental information, was quite eye-opening. And that's, that's something, that dynamic had been operating there for a while. And I can see both sides. I'd been on that side as well, but I think it goes back to, we can't be blindsided. We can't have tunnel vision. And there's some responsibility for those people who are coming from those communities to talk in a similar way that I did, because to the grandma and grandpas, and develop those broad relationships. So that's just as important for either side, whether you're on the right or the left. But that viewpoint needs to be discovered and explored, and can't be blind, sort of, tunnel vision, I guess is the best way to describe it.
And it seems like you're always in between those two worlds. I just saw somebody make a post basically saying, well, why don't we, we had the floods here in the Fraser Valley. One person just posted, well, why aren't we considering just letting the lake come back? And it's like, are you, do you know that, what they're trying to basically argue is that this is how it was prior to colonizers being here, right, or Europeans being here. And so wouldn't it just be great if we went back to not realizing there's an Indigenous school there.
That's right. There's a whole community that's evolved since that time.
Yeah, right? So it's easy to make the claim, why don't we just go back to the way things were 120 years ago? Yeah. But it's simply, that's not what the First Nations community, you're just saying something that sounds like you're being colonization or something, but it's not rooted in, a logical analysis.
You're just recolonizing.
Yeah.
You're sort of recolonizing a space that's not yours. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to, living with communities to understand anything.
Yeah.
Policies implemented in practice, truth to story that you read in the news. For me, I've never been satisfied with picking up the paper and going, oh yeah, that's the way it is. And, for me, and I've done that, I think that's what led me to the people I've interacted with, who've been my mentors. I pick up the phone. I call these people. If I see a story and I'm like, I really want to know, what's the harm in that? And most times people are really excited to share their stories. And, so for me, I'm always very cautious of people who, have these great causes. But the thing is, have you talked to the people that you're having a cause about?
Yeah.
Have you spent time there? And I think that for anything that we do in life, that's So important. And can be easily done, right? There's a business case behind that, especially if you're building your career on a platform of other people's, well, it ends up looking like success on the backs of those who are disadvantaged and, underserved. You kind of have to think a little more clearly, is that, do I really know what's happening there? And really, again, living with community or spending time there, picking up the phone, talking to people.
Yeah, I would say that you act as a way of depoliticizing both sides, which not easy. Even when you think of you go on Facebook and you've got a really close friend and it turns out they're supporting Republican viewpoints, and then you go to your next page and they're
right.
Democrats,
and
you're pulling them together. So could you tell us about what that journey's been like to be between both sides, to sit down with a corporation and understand the real challenges they're facing, and then to be in an Indigenous community and see the very real challenges they're facing and try and articulate that?
I think when I was younger, I had, I would just take it all in and then not reserve enough time for the healing, right? And I feel very grateful for having friends who are adamantly against that pipeline. I mean, fiercely protesting against, but I still call them my brothers and sisters who I get to go to their high school graduations for their kids. And then I have those folks who work with the pipeline, who get it, who, worked with me for so many years to understand at least what the potential could be if the right circumstances happen to continue to exist. And I think for me, where I've been successful, or I guess happy with my approach, is that I feel like I've been consistent with what I can do and what I can bring to the table. And definitely, as I've matured in my career, being able to say, or being able to identify really quickly what I can't do. But I know sort of on a human level what it's like to develop a good friendship. And I've been able to be consistent for those people who know me. And in the work, that's why as a social scientist or a sociologist and anthropologist, using, grounded theory and adapting to an impact assessment context was so important for me, because I knew people would be always challenging me on what I know and how I know it. And I just feel really grateful that the legislation finally is caught up to matching or being able to need the kind of information that I've gotten really good at collecting. So it's that kind of interpersonal consistency. And then again, also professional consistency, that I've developed a methodology that can be easily replicated. It really can. And that's what I want it to be. I don't want it just to sit with me. It needs to be shared. Everybody, and there are requirements, but you're not always going to have a perfect situation. So how do you develop a method and approach that kind of takes that into consideration? And I think I have. That's sort of what I feel really proud being able to share that with our team at Impact Resolutions, and the kind of work that we do that can, really help people make evidence-based decisions, being secure in the kind of information that's being presented. It's really important.
That's amazing. And I think that it's so motivational to hear that, because I feel like we're in a time where it's really easy to delete people you disagree with, to decide
so easy.
this isn't a person that aligns with my values. But you're constantly put in a position where there's both sides, and you can at least understand where they're coming from, even if you don't conclude that their viewpoint's right. And so I'm interested to know what that healing journey is like for you. How did you go about developing that? Because that's a tolling thing. Even when you're trying to, I've been in a room with people I disagree with, and trying to reason it out and hear their viewpoints, and trying to, okay, I'm gonna try and get you to see this perspective. It's draining personally. So
right.
How do you handle that?
I think again, for all the pain that I experienced as a child, in my youth, as an adult, I was able, and I think the healing at the time when I was younger was turning it into purpose. So the purpose of being able to manage really complicated, conversations or being able to overcome, some great, distrust or conflict. That was the purpose. That was also healing on a personal level. And then it caught up to me in my 40s where it's like, oh yeah, I got to deal with my own trauma. And it happened to coincide as I exited the Coastal GasLink project as well, to go, whoa, what happened there? I'd been so focused on, turning pain into purpose sort of individually, what's next? And I, having worked in these contexts for most of my career, it was really impact resolutions that healed me. And in starting a company that I've been able to feel safe in and create a safe space for all the team members to flourish in is kind of another aspect of that healing for me. Because I know people say it's important to separate your professional from your personal, but I can't. I think it should all be complementary and energizing. And people ask me, where do you get your energy from? It's from that. It's being able to, create an environment where people feel safe to be awesome. And to not be bullied, not be harassed, not feel questioned, and being able to take any additional profits. I'm not saying we're growing in the right direction, to test things that people will usually say, well, we've not done that before. I want to be able to say, well, we've tried it and it works. And here it is, right? And because it's not my ideas, this is sort of a collaboration of all of our ideas. So really that healing has been in a professional space for me, because my identity was so crushed at such an early age that I kind of had to find out what that looked like. And again, it was about putting that pain towards a purpose. But really kind of later in my life, it was in impact resolutions that I finally have a safe space. And it's not only because I'm a CEO and the founder of the company, that's an aspect of it, but it's because of the people I get to work with, and the projects that we get to work on. It's like, that's right, I'm doing the right thing. I keep going. So
that's amazing. Can you tell us about your personal background growing up? You said you had to go through some healing journey there. Can you tell us about what it was like growing up and some of the challenges you faced?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I was born in Indonesia. I was adopted as a baby. What I do know about my biological parents is or my biological family, from my mother's side, they were Buginese and Muslim, and fairly sort of high in that community at the time. And my biological mother was very young and gave me away to a Canadian family, a Canadian Irishman and a Chinese Malay woman. Unfortunately, that childhood wasn't at all, having gone through years of, physical and sexual and emotional violence, you build up a bit of a thick skin. And, I've been able to work through that, again, really quite late in my life, but it led me to some interesting places at the same time, because I think as a very young child, I knew I didn't have to stay to feel validated. And so I think it was just in my nature to run away, which I did. And I ended up living in an informal foster system in my early teens and ended up living on my own in sort of my mid to late teens. And, in that, again, sort of healing and sort of finding myself, wasn't great at high school. You also for myself, being a person of color, a minority in sort of a predominantly white Christian community, that also had another dynamic, which again, I see that as gifts. I see that as giving me perspectives and an empathy that has given me the insight to work with the people I do today. And not to say that, I need to be anybody's savior, but again, it gives me that I get it. I get what hurt looks like. I get what misunderstanding looks like. And I was able to turn that into something again, purposeful for me. And that was, really that healing. And I ended up in, working in Indigenous relations. I ended up hitchhiking. I don't recommend this for anybody else, but at the time it seemed like a good idea. And I traveled to the Yukon, Northwest Territories. I was living on reserves. At the time, and this is in the 90s, you could work in bars and no one would card you. And really understanding, like, what's going on here? High rates of poverty, no electricity, no running water. And I'm in Canada. Like, it just kind of confused me more. And the more time I spent there, the more questions I have. So that really drove me to search for that better understanding. That's when I came back to the mainland after a few stop and starts. I was living in Alberta for a while. And I went back to school to really understand that relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and Canada. And there was this new program at Langara College, the Aboriginal Studies program, where, again, that was a huge part of my healing. Like, I was nurtured by some of the best practitioners, like, who again was really focused on, it's not how much you're memorizing. We were graded on how much we were giving back to the community. And I just flourished there. I loved it. Like, some of my biggest mentors who really encouraged me, to further my studies in sociology and anthropology at SFU, and said, SFU will be perfect for you. And yeah, it was there that, with my sort of early years, I feel like I was able to find my calling, although it wasn't a straight path to get there.
That's amazing. Can we go back a little bit? What was it like to not have a connection with your family? Like, was that really challenging to process? How did you kind of overcome that?
Yeah, I didn't probably overcome that or process that too well when I was younger. And that came into, sort of a larger search to understand other people's stories and meet people. The hitchhiking really helped, being able to create the space to daydream and to imagine a different kind of life. I was really into music. I'm a hand percussionist. I like, really having a lot of time on my own as well. So, I camped in the bush for close to 9 months, kind of as I needed to at that time. So, I think it gave me the insight and kind of the space. If I was in my community still, I think I would be a very different person, and I might not be here today. I would have a very different life, but I had this nature to search for something better.
Music is one of those things that I feel like it helps us process some. Like, you go somewhere else, and I don't know why we don't talk about it more.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Dancing, music, like, I think I'm a happy hippie at heart. So I was really attracted to those kinds of people, artists, writers. I wrote a lot too as a young person. I sort of spent a lot of time roaming and wandering. You could say quite a bit of a walkabout for my teens. I think that really helped, and not having this sort of social or familial control telling me what I am, because what people were telling me felt really different from how I felt.
Can you tell us about that? Like, what did you feel like other people thought you were in comparison to who you are? Because I think we all fall into that.
And I see that with youth I work with today. And it was really powerful to learn, in sociology and anthropology, that our lives are constructed by our external influences, but we can reconstruct them. And that's a really powerful thought. And, in my early sort of education, and this is where I get really, energized by anti-racism work, especially in sort of education systems or in other organizations, when when you're young and you're told, well, you're not white enough to, to be in that school play, or to do this or to do that, I didn't have, maybe there's something in my brain that wouldn't accept that kind of criticism, or being called stupid, by teachers and authorities, or even having your sort of that trust by authorities broken through other forms of, abuse. Like I don't know where, I just had this nature not to accept that reality. And that's sort of what kind of propelled me to move on to find my community. Right. And I don't think everyone, I feel myself as really grateful because I know that's not everybody's story. And I remember seeing someone who I grew up with, a mother who lived next door, and she said, I am so surprised you're not drug addicted or a prostitute. Like, that was a real thing she said when she met me again at 18. Like, she was just so impressed that I had overcome that. And at the time, it was sort of like a backhanded compliment, right? Yeah. It's like, okay, yeah, you're right, actually. I am. But that was kind of, the environment or the context that's thrown at you that you don't really, I didn't really take too seriously, but was only able to reflect on kind of later. And, didn't let it penetrate my soul at the time, right? It only kind of energized me and gave me the confidence that I don't need to be here. And I moved 5 different high schools. I lived in Pender Harbor, and then I moved to Vancouver Island with a family because I felt safe with them. That didn't end up, being, that's kind of where I ended up moving on to a number of different high schools and sort of ended up living on my own. But, thank goodness, I had a family who felt sorry for me to take me in. Otherwise, being in that situation, is so toxic. So the work that I do with youth now, I get all that they're going through. I know how, it feels and how important it is to sort of remind ourselves that's one construction, one reality that can be reconstructed. And we can do that by creating a space or focusing on creating a space in our minds that allows us to feel that potential again.
Yeah, it sounds like you're disagreeable in like a healthy way. Like I did a personality test and I scored really high on disagreeableness.
Right, interesting.
Because for me, like when teachers would tell my mom, your kid doesn't look like they're going on the right track, like they're probably going to join a gang, like they're not going to graduate. My mindset was like, you don't know me. Yeah. You're not my friend. Like you don't understand what my home circumstances, like who I am, why I'm like this at school.
You're just assuming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I didn't take what they said to heart. It made me want to prove them wrong. And even now.
Out of spite. That's right. Out of spite, I think I'm successful.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of, I feel you there. And that's it. It's sort of, I was really curious about, especially when I was confronted by that adult who knew me when I met them again at 18. Well, why am I like that? That's kind of where that human interest sort of, resilience, understanding in people became really important. And in the development work that I've done, why I understand why it's important for people to feel included and to feel safe. Like in sharing their information and how precious those stories are to really feel and protect them. And then being able to communicate it in a way where people get it. That's really the sort of where things shine for me because I know what it's like when people spread things about you that aren't true or that you're not able to defend yourself because, some mothers think of you of this way. So I get what all that means when you feel like everything is working against you.
Yeah, and it seems like one of the benefits you had, perhaps benefit and con, was that you were able to leave relationships when they weren't respecting your boundaries or something. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, and I think it's, at the time, it's really good when you're surviving, but it's not really great when you're looking to develop a meaningful interpersonal relationship. So, my familial, my institutional circumstances, the community circumstances, I don't look back with any regret on abandoning toxic relationships.
Was that scary though at the time?
No, it was like when you kind of like being able to step out, and it's a fishbowl, right? And the sort of the energy that comes back to you when you're able to step out of that fishbowl and look at it from that perspective, it's like, oh, what's next? Right. And I didn't have the tools yet to develop good relationships. So it was a lot of trial and error in trusting the wrong people and trusting the right people and screwing up that relationship. And, the unconditional love that people have shown me after me screwing up relationships, I am just in awe and so grateful for, because that's it. It's that unconditional love that is the missing quotient, I think, that's important. But again, I don't think you need, I don't think you need to be like myself, where you need to constantly move to find it. And I only found it later in life. And then it took a lot of practice to develop good friendships that weren't professional, right? That's the thing. And I think I've found that now. And I'm still practicing. I know I'm really messy on some days, and again, I feel really safe at impact resolutions because I can, there's forgiveness on being, not perfect, I guess. And that's what I try to say. It's not about being perfect. It's about being able to screw up and being okay with that. Right.
Yeah, I really think that that's such an important example that you're setting, because so many people have bad relationships with their family, and there's different stories that you're going to find, but there's this sense of like, this is who I am, I guess, and this is my family. And I think the biggest growing part, and I know that it's perhaps cliche to say, but family isn't just in the blood. You can have strong familial relationships. Like my grandmother, who's not my biological grandmother, is why I started this. And I think that being able to appreciate what she did, adopting my mother and raising her, was such a benefit. And now it's like, how do I build on that legacy? But I really appreciate your willingness to admit that like you perhaps pushed boundaries in those early stages, because I think that that's what people do when they've been hurt, is they want to see, are you going to be here if I screw up, or are you only here because it's the good time?
You said it. That's exactly it. You're constantly testing relationships because you're used to being disappointed. You're just waiting for that other ball to drop, or that, people want just to be my friend because they want to sexualize me or treat me horribly or think that I'm, you kind of integrate that into testing relationships. And, you do that when you're young. And then as you age, again, that's where I took that pain into purpose by applying it into schools and, or into my education, because that gave me a space where I was an equal ground and people can evaluate me on what I produced versus, what I looked like. I shaved my head a couple of times when I was just like really trying to minimize myself physically or sort of externally because I wanted people to see the inside.
That's one thing that always stands out to me. I'll see people walking down the road with blue hair or red hair, and I know that the common trope is to like judge them and be like, what are you doing? But
I get it.
For me, it's like, this is what they have control over, or what they feel like they have control over in their life is just, that's all I've got is my hair. And that's all that I feel like people are judging me here, here, and here. So the only thing I get to decide on is what color my hair is. And I sympathize with that, because there is a sense of your life is predetermined by other people's perceptions of who you can go become. And often people don't leave their community to go figure out, who am I without these people's viewpoints of me kind of influencing how I see myself.
Well, and you said it, like, so these are the communities and circumstances of which I'm entering as a proponent. Like, I'm coming out and triggering conversations and asking people to test their identities and their relationships based on things that they didn't really ask for. And that I always you're right, it's what do people feel like they have control of? And we need to consider that when we're developing policies for people. Supposedly, like, it's more than just the things that we need to feed ourselves and survive on. It's the, like, how much how empowered do people feel or not feel? Yeah, I look at people with blue hair, I'm like, like kind of like this. And I remember telling a colleague, oh, I can't wait to dye my hair like pink now that I have my own company. And I had a friend go, no. Just wait and build up your your reputation first before you start meeting clients with a shaved, mohawk.
Yeah, but it's a weird relationship we have though, right? Because we're lucky, and I think that this is a growing conversation of like, we're happy, and I'm happy to see more women running organizations and leading the way. And so we're trying to break down some of these perceptions on what's correct business practices and what's incorrect.
What's good etiquette, not good etiquette. And it really, you just wish and you desire, and I think people like you and me to us to see sort of being evaluated on what we do versus on what we look like, right? Yeah. And it's, I'm excited, and I see that going in the right direction too. I just hope it doesn't fall into the direction of forgetting about those, our emotional aspects or spiritual aspects, because I think once we do, we fall back into the status quo. Yeah. Right.
And I think it's easy to do those types of things, dye your hair and stuff for the wrong reasons. And I say that's probably the predominant, like if it's an 80-20 rule, it's probably 80% of people doing it for the feeling like they don't have control. Mm-hmm. And so when you see it, there is an assumption maybe this person's got something going on in their life that's not going right. And this is what they're doing to kind of try and handle that. Yeah. But what was that kind of development into going to school? Was that a tough transition from being able to be so free?
Oh my gosh, it was incredible. But again, it was this weird needing to prove myself that I'm worth it and that I can do this. Because having been told throughout my whole education that I'm not good enough or smart enough, it became fueled by this really wanting to understand that relationship between Indigenous peoples and Canada. And I had some really great mentors and, who, again, I found that purpose, and I was struggling. I had to learn how to write again. And I went to Douglas College first, actually. You had to kind of upgrade yourself as a mature student to be qualified to be able to apply. And passing that first year was such a huge, I did that, and oh yeah, like the struggles, but also it was able to fuel back sort of something that I wasn't getting outside. Like I was able to produce that for myself. And I was the kind of student where, I was obsessed about doing the right thing, about doing it well. And I'm so glad I did, because I was able to build that muscle memory after really struggling, that, by the time I reached my graduate work, I was just such a better writer. And even now I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm such a great writer compared to what I was. Like writing is I love writing journals, but technical writing, that's something that I'm really proud of myself. I've been able to sort of build into muscle memory versus, having when I started out starting school again. That was a real challenge.
Right. You've mentioned mentors a few times. Who were some of those people, and what, people impact us in ways that perhaps we don't expect or we don't see in the moment. So who were some of those people? And hopefully people can hear this and see how they can perhaps set a better example for the people around them. Who were some of those people, and what did they do that made them make you see them in such high esteem?
Yeah, I think, I'm so grateful for those who continue to love me. I think even, in my early years where I was just such a screw up and, really screwed up a number of times. So my uncle, who's now passed, he was a big influence on my life, and, he knew there were rough times to bring me out fishing, and that's where we wouldn't talk, but he knew that's the space I needed. There are other mentors.
Sorry, what were those fishing trips like, and how did that come about?
Oh, well, he's a prawn fisherman in Pender Harbor, and he would just take me out in the boat early in the morning, and we would be out in the boat all day. And this is sort of after like collecting me from being just, a bad kid in the streets, like at the middle of the night. And then kind of like my punishment would be, let's go fishing. And just kind of having that one-on-one time with him.
So was this your biological
No,
uncle?
he was this sort of like your grandma. He was really good friends of my mom. My uncle Dwight and my auntie Juanita, they were from the Yukon, diamond miners, had 5 kids, and the majority of their kids were still there. And, he was just one of those really great, solid guys who also did not have a great sort of youth and maybe early years, and saw, I don't know, something special in me, and just felt that he knew I didn't have anybody. And sort of when I was still at home and before I ran away, that was, he always kept me kind of in high regard still, and was always kind of there, not to punish me in a way where I'm not going to hear it. He would just kind of just take me away from the space and the anger I was feeling and go out fishing all the time. Wow. So, yeah, I have really fond memories. And I spent my whole childhood like a really young kid fishing. Like, I was a big tomboy, so that's kind of where...
Do you still fish at all?
I do, actually, yeah. I ended up working at a fishing lodge between semesters, 15 years ago now, but then I still fish when I can. I don't enough. I tried fly fishing when I was living in Telkwa. Horribly, so different from ocean fishing. So, yeah, I love the water. I like being able to sort of, being able to think like I'm feeding myself in that way. But yeah, he was a big mentor. And Helen, Dr. Helen Cruz, who actually, it was in an effort to try to meet more Indonesian people in Vancouver, because I didn't know anybody. I just ended up picking up the phone book when phone books were more available, and, searching for Indonesian people, or who I thought were Indonesian people. My name is Pepi, and I really want to learn more about the Indonesian culture, and can you introduce me to anyone? Would you like to meet with me? And the Consular General of the Indonesian Consular General here in Vancouver, he took pity on me, and he invited me over to break fast with them during Ramadan, as it is today. And that's where I met Dr. Helen Cruz, who is a sociologist trained in Cornell. And she's Filipina, but she had lived in Indonesia for a decade more, and actually had really helped me try to find more information on my biological parents. We fell in love. I mean, like, she's the kind of lady, and she's 84. We see each other, like, she's like my mom, basically. She, salsa dances, she drinks beer, she walks up mountains, and, like, she's been doing that until COVID, right? Like, she's just... And the person who gave me my first international opportunity. So, really taught me a lot about what's important in my field. Like, she's the first woman in international development doing what I do. She worked in the 60s and 70s in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. I've later done work in these areas too, but she was the only woman at the table at that time, and was always fierce about where are the women. Where are the women? That was her first question. And, she really impressed upon me, it's not how much you know, it's how much you're sharing, how much you're giving away, how much you're passing on this knowledge, because it doesn't mean anything if it sits inside you. So she's, in terms of family, she's my family.
Was that hard to reach out to the Indonesian community, or exciting?
I was excited. Like, I kind of always done that. Like, if I saw it interesting, I kind of just pick up the phone and just wanting to learn more. How can I help? And so it wasn't at the time. Maybe in reflection, if I was doing it now, it might be. But no, it was really lovely. And I continue to interact with the Indonesian community here. Certainly discovering my religion more, just sort of more about the immigrant experience here as well. So, yeah, I continue to work with them.
Can you tell us about the religious elements? Because one of my passions that's come since my grandmother has passed is she was a Catholic,
Right.
and now I'm interested in the Indigenous culture, but I'm interested in where they overlap. So, like, a quick example would be like grace and salmon
Right,
ceremonies.
yeah.
There's an overlap between the two, and so I enjoy hearing that. And I think that right now it's an unpopular time to be believing that religion has some sort of value, but I think the tenets of how to live a good life exists there, and so I'm interested
Me too.
to know.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, it's about, in terms of the Muslim religion, I see 5-time praying, 5 times a day as making that space for you to focus. It's your time of meditation, like fasting. Like there are all these elements of religion that we can take it to be what you want it to be. And for me in my adulthood, I've really embraced sort of my roots and working in areas that are largely Muslim populated. That's where I've really sort of discovered my religion in that regard, and taken them as sort of instruction on sort of, and giving me that space to really focus on healing and that connection with God. But it's, and I think with, as it might be for someone who's Catholic in the same way, it's just sort of making that time to give thanks, to pay respect. And gosh, I'll take any instruction and structure around that, because it's not something I can do. And I've maybe always tried to meditate or create that space, but I really enjoy sharing those rituals with people and being able to celebrate things with people and have that sense of belonging, I think is really important. And you can find it in religion, or you can find it elsewhere, but for me, it's important to find it somewhere.
Yeah, I just feel like right now we have it better than I think we've ever had it in human history in terms of resources and being able to, like, if you think of when you were growing up, there wasn't like resources for counseling that were just super accessible.
Not at
And so
all.
the world's so different
Yeah.
now that we can address, but yet it seems like we've never been worse. That, like, when we look at the depression rates or the anxiety rates and we look at these things, it feels like we're always looking to perhaps be more productive or get something more done, and it's never enough. And then you think of being grateful for what we have and slowing down and going, wow, like I have this incredible avocado that had to travel from this whole other country.
Supply chains, exactly. Like when you start to look at that, it's like, wow, like you just see how everything is connected. And you're right. It's sort of the spirituality component, the religious component is something, I was really hopeful with COVID. If you're going to see a silver lining, is finally people could slow down and take the space they might have used for travel to get to work for something in themselves. And that's certainly the approach I took. And I don't know if the timing is right where people are more sensitive to that, or at least more accepting that we can have different kinds of beliefs and interests that might not be professionally driven, right? Our success is not the dollars that we make. It's really the time and how we're able to use that time. I don't know if that's a cliche, but it feels really important to me. And my idea of success is sort of like, can I travel at certain points of the year? Can I travel anywhere and work? Like those are things that, I'd really like to explore and make possible.
Yeah, I love that your mindset regarding like finding a way for your work to be also your passion and your life, because I always think it's strange when people are seeking to completely separate the two and put one into one category and one in the other. And I think that that's sort of what you have to do if you're doing a job like McDonald's, where you don't care about like what the outcome's going to be, but you still come home at the end of the day and you're frustrated by what happened at work. So your personal life isn't allowed to leak into your professional work, but your professional work absolutely leaks into your personal life. And that's where, like, when I was growing up, I'd see people like parents abuse their children because they hate their job. And so it's like you can't pretend that you're separating the two, at least in my opinion.
No, and for that reason alone, because, if we don't feel, if we separate them, then we're just going to project that anger without context, right? And it's Yeah, I've seen that too, and I'm also guilty of leaking that, the professional stress is seeping into how I might treat my partner, because I feel like what's happening in my mind is more important than what's happening right here.
Yeah.
And that's where, again, the healing and impact resolutions has given me that safety, that space. Again, I keep repeating space, but it's really important for me that I can really, I don't know, I guess sort of explore what that possibility might look like, and for everybody, like on the team, because it almost killed me to separate that too, where the professional was just all that there was, and especially when you're doing community work. But where are you in that? You're hidden, you're diminished, and that wasn't healthy either.
Particularly because you're going into communities and it's who you are that they're connecting with.
Yeah.
And when that's not able to be replenished or be noticed or valued, and when it's because it sounds like
it gets toxic. You start self-medicating, it gets nasty, and that's not healthy either, right? It's sort of, again, it's quick fixes. And that's where I think the religious component has really forced me to slow down. And, when I was speaking about Roxy and Suki, like that was the moment where I made a decision for myself that I don't have to always leave.
Sorry, could you say who Roxy and Suki is?
my two Shih Tzus. But it was really that decision. Like, I've always wanted dogs, but that was always a symbol that my life is going to be really changing, because my career, I was always away. And right now, I can be away, but I want to be able to bring them. And if I can't, I'm not going to take that contract. It needs to fit. So that was really symbolic for me to make that decision.
And it sounds like it grounded you a little bit to something, to an area, to a spot that you might not have had previously.
Oh, absolutely. And like I was saying earlier, I love the Fraser Valley, and I'm feeling really honored that we're here, because I get to work, and then there's some really great dog walks everywhere. It's really exciting. So I feel like all the things that I've been able to reflect on the past, while messy at times, and I for anybody who's listening and who's known me, and I love you, I care about you, and thank you for being part of my journey. And I hope I was able to share, and that was reciprocal, that you got something from me too.
Right. That is absolutely beautiful. And I think we're lucky that you're willing to share that part of the journey, because it's so easy to get caught up in the work life and getting, I need to get here. And I see that a lot with law students, is that we're always looking for the next step, and where are we going to go now? And how are we going to go succeed there? And then how are we going to climb that ladder?
Oh, absolutely. It becomes so strategic that you forget about the moments that are grounding and that are important, because it's not sustainable because I did that up until my 40s. It was like that. Like, it was like, and then you hit a wall, and your body tells you you can't work anymore.
Yeah.
Your body will tell you before your mind will tell you. So for me, as I reach, I'm 45 this year, I think, and I'm really excited about that I'm finally really thinking about how work fits into me versus the other way around.
I really admire that, because the thing that silently breaks my heart the most is when people I don't want to date myself, and it's like, I have a lot of guests who have said that, and it's why is that a bad thing? My mindset is that, and I'm having on a nurse who's an expert in aging shortly here, because I think we look at aging we look at it as you're devaluing yourself over time, and I don't agree with that.
I don't agree with that either. I love aging, and I forget my age quite often. And this is from Dr. Helen Cruz. She's 84 and just didn't know her age until her body told her, yeah, you're 84. And you can't, but it was that frame of mind that it was so intoxicating. And I feel really blessed about having known her for so long, since my early 20s, right? So yeah, it really starts here, but getting there is, I don't want to give any impression that this journey was easy to get to that frame of mind where I'm not concerned about my age, because I know that took a lot of work to get there. like a lot of work.
Can you tell us just about some of the things you hope somebody else, if you were to give advice to somebody who's going through, maybe they're thinking of leaving home, what would your advice to them be to kind of get through those times?
Yeah, going back to, who we think we are, and we have a constructed identity, and again, the beauty in that we can reconstruct that, but getting our minds and our energy and ourselves out of bed is to find that purpose, whatever that is, to do it. And it's, sometimes it's minute by minute that, you pass that minute and you're okay. And then, it's every 15 minutes till it's every hour. That's okay. And, don't rush yourself that you need to be perfect or anything until you find it inside. And I think that's what saved me for sure.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So then you take this course at Langara.
Right. Yeah.
And then you move on to go to SFU. What was that? Was that intimidating at all? Like SFU's got a strong brand name, a little intimidating.
It wasn't. Like grad school was intimidating for sure. But my BA, I was just really coming off that, yay, let's change the world. And I found looking at our social construction of reality through sort of a class lens, and could really find some understanding around, some of the issues in sort of the Indigenous rights and title sphere. Like I was coming off of that, like on land claims and understanding how people are disadvantaged in economic and political systems. So I was really excited at SFU to sort of be immersed in another way of looking at the world that we live in, and a way to reframe it to make it better. So yeah, I was really energized by it. And I was just, I fell into a really great, amazing group of people that became, really close during those years of university. I just got really involved in a lot of different kind of social activities, and I really flourished at that time. And that's sort of where I got the energy and this light to sort of explore more about myself and my Indonesian heritage. And another mentor, Marilyn Gates, and others, John Bogardus, like Marilyn Gates, like my first class, and she's an anthropologist, like really this fierce, amazing woman who's very grounded in a heart-centered approach, right? And taught us that, anthropologists are going through their own identity crisis, and really imparted upon us, it's not how much you're taking, it's how much you're giving back, like this spirit of reciprocity, this mutual benefit in research. And she scolded us. She's like, your success is not your own. Your success is because of the group, the community of people, whether they're related to you or not, who helped to bring you here. And it was just like, wow, this woman was just like so inspiring, and gave me that sort of room to really grow with some really crazy ideas. Like she was just like, go for it. Like she was like really excited about my thinking at that time, and John Bogardus as well. And I already started working in the Philippines too. So I was just so busy and really enjoying my education.
So in Indigenous culture, we have this idea of 7 generations, that we're supposed to look back on those 7 generations of people and what their hopes were, their dreams, their aspirations. Like I think of particularly like with Indian residential schools, what would have been the hopes, prayers, and dreams of the people attending those schools, and how can my generation play those dreams and hopes out? Right. What was that like for you? Because that's sort of what it sounds like she was saying, was that like, what can you take from their story and the community around you and how they've built you up? What can you build upon in regards to that?
Yeah, when I started the work in the Philippines in the involuntary resettlement context and living with them, how I interpreted that was actually founding the Enrichment League, which, for me, permission to be invited back. But I started a nonprofit in 2007, and it was this collective effort from university students, and it was really, and then I was also putting myself through uni. I was an onboard supervisor at this local cruise ship company, so I would hold like fundraising, sort of efforts with live local musicians, and sort of like being able to bring people together to share the stories of why we were raising money, because $3,000 would put 3 schools for 12 months, their teacher salaries, education supplies. So for me, it was like, of course I would do that. So it was around, the nonprofit, and we still continue it today, was really giving opportunities for communities to develop independent economies from industry and government, whatever that looks like. Today it looks like, and we're doing through impact resolutions in the form of sustainable ecocultural tourism in Pakistan and Turkey and Lebanon, around the same principles about sort of creating economies that are independent from government and industry. But at the time in 2007, I was holding a lot of sort of live local fundraising music sort of endeavors.
How did you have the confidence to do something? You think of
I
people...
just did it. I don't even know. I just again was surrounded by a great group of people who really were just like really motivated by the cause.
And then, like, you just decided one day, or did this take time to build up? Like,
it was one day. I ended up sort of, again, picking up the phone book and going, oh, there's other nonprofits out there, and ended up partnering with Eco de Saloro. I'm saying this really wrong, but it was a nonprofit doing similar kinds of things in the Okanagan. And it was my first, actually, introduction to consensus-based decision-making. And they were actually just going through their AGM, and I was on the... so whether they would accept my proposal, but they were making some decisions in a consensus format that took 2 days. I was like, what? It was my first, I'd always sort of promoted consensus-based decision-making, but to really be in it. And that's where I was only planning to be there for an afternoon, but I ended up being there for 3 days, and they accepted me, and I was able to use their charitable tax status to then raise the money. And yeah, it just kind of grew from there. And it was my work with Harbour Cruises and the work that I did with the student union that I was able to, again, to sort of leverage those other spheres in my life to then raise money. And when I used to I loved dancing, and of course, an opportunity to meet live local musicians and invite them into the cause. People were really great about donating their time, or at least partial their time.
Was it hard to organize, or did it come pretty easy?
I've been in the food and beverage industry since I was 9. I started out as a dishwasher and have moved my way up through. So at Harbour Cruises, I was organizing huge events. Oh, okay. So I'm really, actually, and then in my early 20s, I had my own bartending business for like kind of other events, but I'm used to organizing events that way. So yeah.
And then you did that traveling, and you were working with communities. Yeah. When did it become more official? When did it?
Yeah, I think at the time when I did my graduate, even though I was working while I was doing my BA, I would only go there when I had time off, of course, and then it increased when I started. I had permission to use that work that I was doing in the Philippines as part of my graduate work as well. So I continued on at SFU to do my sociology and anthropology graduate work. And that was there. I did, 9 months of field work. It was a PhD packed into a master's thesis, but I should have done a PhD. But at the time, I was like, and another mentor of mine kind of suggested, if you love doing this work, stay in it by just getting your master's. And I agreed. I said, I just want to continue doing the great work. So it was after my graduate work, then I was hired.
Sorry, what was your master's work on? Because it's very interesting.
Okay, yeah. It's a sociology and anthropology graduate work through a medical sociological lens, trying to understand the psychosocial impacts of involuntary resettlement in the San Roque Dam case. And really, again, I was really keen on developing a socioeconomic impact assessment tool that would be easily replicated and that would give the information that a proponent would need very early on to develop the information requirements for proper scoping. So that's where I think, most development or any projects fall short, is having the right information to make better decisions about budget.
Sorry, that was very intimidating, I think, for some people who don't know what socio-economic.
Sorry, yeah. So there's a requirement. So socioeconomic impact assessment is really understanding all the social parts of our environment. So a company might want to understand the biophysical aspects if they build there, or what the impacts on water quality. And at the time, socioeconomic impact assessment was one way to understand people. And I think it has some, there are limitations to that. So my career really built on the gender, and then, the community health aspects, again, building that medical, sociological, psychosocial lens, like the emotional aspects, the sense of place. And then I later in my career, I realized we're actually talking about cumulative effects, or our cumulative selves. So it would encompass all those things. So
that's incredible. And how did that go over? Because with a master's, you have to submit it, get reviewed.
It went really well, actually. The graduate sort of defense, because again, my professors, like they acknowledged how much work went in. Like, this is 2 communities with, oh gosh, I can't remember how many interviews I did, but I was able to show how it was applied. So it was easily defended. And I'm just so grateful to, and also these 2 mentors of mine as well, Dr. Fernando De Mayo and Dr. Michael Hathaway. Dr. De Mayo was the medical sociology statistician, and then Dr. Hathaway was the anthropologist, very qualitative. So I got these really great, like, qualitative, quantitative training. And for some reason, I did really well at statistics, which I didn't expect to do so well, because I screwed up in high school. I failed math so many times, but statistics just clicked for me.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so you started working primarily with corporations, and then later on you started impact resolutions. Can you tell us about that time working with corporations?
Yeah, thank you. So mostly, in a corporate context, that was before impact resolutions. We expected to continue working in those industries, but we also realized that it was sort of the natural gas bust in terms of where companies would need our set of skills and environmental application process. So, we started doing other work that was more community focused with Indigenous groups, and, with Indigenous groups who were sitting at the opposite end of the table. We were now working for them, with impact resolutions. And it was a long lead, I would say. It was myself, and there are 23 members that founded it with me, who were in on a, either had their foot in the door just to kind of keep involved because they'd want to jump ship and retire with impact resolutions one day, or they were involved on a part-time to full-time basis. I would be remiss not to mention Sir Murray Slezak, who's, I would say, more like an older brother, even a father figure to me, who, when I came back from working internationally, came back to Canada, he was the only person to see my set of skills as important and valuable, because I had to start back from scratch back in Canada. And he hired me through a consulting firm to do the socioeconomic impact assessment for LNG Canada, which I ended up doing for most of the major facilities in BC at the time. But he ended up joining me at Impact Resolutions, and I would not have the company if it wasn't without him, who kept us going, being able to help with financing a lot of the projects in terms of developing the materials we need for project proposals, business development, and is really just has been amazing mentor and coach. And I think a lot of, maybe I'm making an assumption, but it was not, like, when I first started the company, a lot of the questions I was asked was, oh, don't you have children? How are you going to start that? Really? I'm like, no, I don't have children, number one. But would you ask a man. I was kind of like, so it was an unforgiving environment for a woman of color who's very small as well. So it was really great to have Murray, who just really endorsed us, and we still have a majority of the members who are involved. And so because those major projects weren't flourishing at that time, we ended up really focusing on smaller projects and just got bigger and bigger. And any additional funds we would put into our passion projects. And our passion projects have really 6 years later are now our regular clients, which is really cool.
So what made you want to start Impact Resolutions? What was going on previously that kind of made you go, I'm ready to branch out on my own and have my own philosophy and play that out? Because I think one interesting thing is that we see and I don't know if I'm just a pessimist, but I see the mission, value statements, philosophy,
me too.
And you read it and you kind of
really?
go, sure, that's what your priority is at Coca-Cola. Like, I'm sure that this is what you're worried about. So what made you kind of go, this is what I'm ready to do. I want to bring my worldview into reality.
It was a healing journey for me. After my last sort of, working for a corporation, that was a very jarring experience. And again, the work with communities was a lot easier than dealing with the corporation itself. And again, I feel very grateful for those executive leadership who were there to really shield me from the rest of the corporation to do my work. And once they retired, let's just say I exited. And I was provided a very healthy, how do you say, a bonus. And it was that bonus. It's like, this is what I need to do. And it was really that being able to prove that I'm valuable, I'm worth it. I really love my work and I wanted to continue that work. That's where I put that bonus and into starting Impact Resolutions. And having worked with the majority of people that are in Impact Resolutions in previous years, they too had experienced something similar. Like, this was a time where thousands of people were being laid off, in a matter of weeks. Like the city of Calgary, I'm not sure if you remember that time. It was really harsh. And then those who remained in those environments were, their workload had quadrupled and it was just so toxic. So those people who left those environments, I was able to attract because they'd worked with me before. They knew what I'm capable of in terms of running a project, creating a safe environment where people felt awesome to flourish. And that was sort of the promise that I made, that, I did a lot of research as well on how to run or how to keep really awesome people. So creating projects that are meaningful, giving business development opportunities to people if they want it, but not forcing it upon them. Creating a very clear work structure. And again, that over time sort of has been more refined, but I knew that was really important, and pay people well, right? That as well. I know in a lot of like I pay people top dollar. It's not maybe as good as, oil and gas, but certainly just better than United Nations rates. And everyone knew what everyone else was making. So having that transparency and that was kind of really, the focus was on building a really good environment, which I probably put too much effort into the beginning and which has benefited us in the end. But refining the business development approach really came a little bit later. After 3 years, we were just, applying for requests for proposals, being denied. And it's sort of like, it's very dehumanizing. So we instead kind of took all the energy we would put into that and put it into our interpersonal networks. So let's say we have a community, we interact with that community. Well, we'll raise the money so we can work together. That has become way more successful than, these.
Hold on, break that down for people, because that seems
sure.
that seems like when you're thinking of doing a business, that seems like unlikely.
Right. Well, but that's the kind of work we wanted to do, right? So it's, we have established this really great rapport and built long life relationships with a lot of communities and nonprofit organizations. What if instead of spending 30 hours into a request for proposal for some blind government contract, what if we then worked with a community, identified the needs, identified the funding, applied for it, won it, and then we would continue the work. And has been more successful in terms of the kinds of work that we're winning versus this blind RFP approach.
And you're also building a relationship from the outset that we're trying to help you
together.
And
that's sort of where that's the sweet spot in my mind, and that's sort of where our passion projects are becoming our regular clients now.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about the decision? Because I'm sure you're seeing all over the news right now, can't find good people. You can't find good people, can't afford good people. And I think that your approach, I don't believe that you can't find good people.
I think you can.
Yeah.
I really do. And we've never had to put out a sort of a posting, an ad posting, because our work is generated very organically and based on the things that really energize us. So, not to say we still love doing the large scale impact assessments, but it's extremely competitive. And when there's such great other projects to be done. So, Murray has just done such remarkable things into building sort of an auditing team, an assessor team. We're still working in the natural gas industry, but we're now auditing their work. We're still, doing regulatory work, but now we get to do work for regulatory agencies, right? So, but it's all because I've been thinking and I've been working and building teams like this for so many years. It's now I get to do it for myself. I know who we need to do X, Y, and Z.
Right. And so when you're hiring people on and you're talking about business development, can you just tell us about what that initial conversation with a potential staff member looks like? Because it almost seems like it's lip service for so many organizations to say, oh, we'll get you training. And then it's like 2-hour course every year that you don't want to attend or something.
Well, and to be quite honest, it's a growing company, right? I'm a single woman who founded a company to give an opportunity to people who are consultant professionals. So I provide insurance, I provide them benefits, and the protection as working as an independent consultant without having the additional burden and the costs of that. And so how that works is, as well, Impact Resolutions provides the quality assurance, quality control, the graphic design. So independently, you have to be all those things. But Impact Resolutions, when we win projects together, that's, you be your subject matter expert, you then 5 different people writing one thing is then given to me. I do the quality assurance, quality control, editing, global editing in one voice, and then produce a remarkable graphic design output. It's just, that's kind of how we operate. So that's in bringing in new members. It's really to fit the things that we are probably expanding on. The founding members, the 18 of us, we've grown it together to this point. So we've been able to attract work based on our interpersonal networks.
That's amazing. And it just reminds me, I work with Alpine Legal Services, and his approach has been, I don't want my name on a door. I don't want my name on a building. I want to do the marketing. I want to do the branding. I want to make sure the lawyers are protected. But then they come work for me.
Totally.
They get a certain percentage of whatever they bring in or whatever work they're doing, but then they don't have to worry about branding themselves, marketing, doing those elements.
That's very similar to what Impact Resolutions has to offer. Team members who want to join. And then there's others who, just kind of want to do the one-off project here and there because the kind of projects that we do are fun for them. It's not kind of the regular usual things to do.
And then they don't have they need to complete 35 hours and they're not interested.
That's right. Yeah. And, it's deadline driven. So, I'm very clear around sort of what needs to be done in a particular time. And that's really my job. Like I'm probably less and less on the subject matter technical expert. I'm more just organizing the teams and the projects and then future business development.
Right. So when you were starting this, though, I imagine some of the feedback you would have gotten is, you're crazy. You can't do this. You need to have 35-hour work weeks and you need to do it this way. So
and I had to. Like I was still continuing to work full time and then running the business. But my approach has always been, in keeping a great team, I'm building the business for them first. So they get all the hours, as long as I can still keep them and keep on going. So I would have full-time work elsewhere and still managing the company, ensuring that those team members, because I had no funding coming in. I was like, the only funding is the ones that I was generating. So any other full-time employment was all going back into the company.
That's a lot of work, though. You're doing two. What was that? What were those initial days like? Was that?
That's normal for me. Like I'm just working and living on your own since you 3 jobs, school full time. Like that was actually a less of a work week than usually.
Because I guess you're building something that you believe in.
Yeah, I think so. It was more clean. Like you remove the stress of the toxicity at a workplace. And even if I was getting at a workplace, I had this, it's okay because there's a greater goal here. Like I can handle the bullying now because I don't have to be here for a long time.
Right.
I can say no whenever I want to.
Yeah. And so are you particularly working with any area like BC, or are you still international? What kind of levels are you?
It's BC, mostly BC, Alberta, northeastern BC. But then again, we're, really starting in Pakistan and Turkey is probably our major focus areas right now.
And what brings that about? How do you make a decision like that?
Yeah. Well, Pakistan actually came about organically as well. I'd met Arshad Jami, who the kind of sociologists and anthropologists that we are in involuntary resettlement, living with communities as a way to understand policies and practice is quite unique, like in terms of really pushing that method. And Arshad reached out to me 2015 is like, hey, you do this work too. And we just ended up building such a great professional relationship where he joined Impact Resolutions when I started the company. And he's a premier sociologist working for all the major dam projects in Pakistan. And, we just had that real connection. He came to me one day, he's like, love involuntary resettlement, but what do you think about sustainable ecocultural tourism? And he was starting to work with sort of programs in Pakistan. It was a reconciliation programs to invite Sikhs and Buddhists back to Pakistan after they were exiled in 1947. The current prime minister is on this huge reconciliation program. So a lot of monies were being put back into restoring these gurdwaras and Buddhist sites where a lot of sort of the major spiritual sites happen for Sikhs and Buddhists. So that's kind of where we started that sustainable ecocultural tourism there, providing immersive experiences, helping reunify or reconcile relationships between those who were exiled and help sort of rediscover areas that they had been exiled from. And we did a soft tour actually in March 2020, just as COVID was going to hit, but it was remarkable. We were able to apply it, and we were just kind of testing out what it was going to be like. And we were able to find this one grandfather's house, and it was great. We were just coming to Tawana, and in a matter of 4 hours, we had the whole community coming with us to find where we thought he lived, and we found the place where he lived, in addition to the temple that he used to pray at.
I am always learning something new. Can you tell us a little bit more about the exile of these individuals?
Yeah, it was when basically, so Britain had I guess, a process of decolonization. India and Pakistan split in 1947, where Muslims predominantly reigned in Pakistan, and it was through a natural border. I can't remember the river now, and then most others remained in India. And it was that time where many Sikhs who were overnight had to leave their homes as Pakistan and India became separated due to decolonization of Britain.
Wow.
Yeah, I am not as well versed in this history as I should be, but that's kind of the working knowledge that I have, and more recently now, certainly in this sort of spirit of reconciliation, it's really exciting to see and to work in Pakistan and sort of an opportunity to see opportunities for tourism and the areas of the north and how diverse and how welcoming and loving the people are. And Turkey kind of came about, well, because of COVID, we had to stop our tourism there. So Turkey came about, Arshad, kind of in a similar way. It was like, oh, well, what about Turkey? And so we started our kind of doing some scouting for Turkey. And now we're really we've already developed some relationships with local nonprofits to provide charitable, meaningful tourism engagement opportunities. So we hope to hit a market that wants to travel, visit areas in Turkey, but work with a nonprofit that we're working to maybe do work to empower girls' education. So we're working on what that's going to look like over the next, actually in September, we're going to be doing a tour and working with that nonprofit, Pepita, who's already been operating for 11 years. We're just hoping to collaborate with them.
Wow.
Yeah.
When you're growing this, what have you kind of seen, or what is your perspective on where maybe BC is going in terms of, are we moving in the right direction? I saw that Stahelis First Nation just did their reconciliation agreement. Tawasin came to their agreement like 10 years ago now. So are you feeling like we're slow and steady wins the race and we're on the right track, or what are you seeing?
I think I need to, having spent time in those communities, I think they have had to learn as they go. I think now, again, going back to creating that space for communities to really explore on their own for what they feel is valuable in their communities first before it being triggered on the outside, I think we're moving in the right direction. But there are isolated areas that have sort of problems that are intergenerational, that are really savage. The opioid crisis, for instance, is a pandemic, and that worries the heck out of me for all communities, no matter where. It's this, there's, again, that gap in terms of what we think a community and a society is that we need to pay special attention to, because people are self-medicating. Right? People need to, and Impact Resolutions is really blessed. We're supporting the All Nations Outreach Society, who, is the first of its kind program, really with the Haisla Nation, with the monies they got from LNG, to the first of its kind outreach program with James Harry Sr. To provide unconditional ongoing love and support for those lost and drug addicted on the downtown east side for when they're ready for it. And since we started, working together in the last couple of years, there's partnerships with BC Housing, First Nations Health Authority, Ministry for Social Development and Poverty Reduction, where they're able to help more and more people and more nations through lunch programs, through, water and land-based healing programs, because I think if we continue to focus on, that healing for when people are ready, I think we're moving in the right direction. But he's like, they are a small army that, needs to grow. And Impact Resolutions is really there to provide the administrative and governance support because of all the background stuff. But I think if more and more people focus on kind of the direct human parts, instead of it being, this is an institutional thing that I work for, and X, Y, and Z, and it becomes quantitative and statistical, then that's dangerous. But if we can marry or sort of mix the two in terms of evidence-based decision-making, I think we're going to be okay.
Yeah, I think that it's such an interesting time because my challenge, I guess, as a native court worker was that I would send people to treatment places where I knew that there was somebody with who is still recovering
Yeah.
running the place. And then it's like, well, I want to set this person up in the best way I can, but the resource I'm sending you to is
They need to be
imperfect.
healthy too.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's sort of where, looking at James and all his volunteers and the board members is just so empowering and inspiring, right? He has a story himself of addiction and recovery and then giving back. I encourage you to introduce, that introduction for sure, because it's just mind-blowing, like how effective his small team is compared to those big nonprofit organizations who claim to do the same thing. But it's really the timing of being able to coordinate multiple organizations for when that person is ready to heal that James has been able to sort of overcome by being available and visible to that person. But then quickly, there's no time lag. The support is there and he drives people back home. And sometimes it's like 16 hours away for when those people are ready to heal.
That's a really interesting point you make. I feel the same way. I feel I've worked with a lot of nonprofits. I've gotten to see what they say they do in comparison to
what they do.
Yeah, and that's probably the most disheartening is that I've worked with places that are supposed to be shelters for women, and then the feedback you get is like, this was like they were rude, they talked down to me, they kicked me out because I came 10 minutes late, and it's like, and I see, like, when I started as a native court worker, one of my the values I went in with is I'm not going to fix anybody. I'm going to help people when they're kind of ready, and they're probably going to fall. And the executive director of the native court workers does a really good job of saying your job isn't to get someone out of the court system. Your goal is to make the periods in which they're not in the court system longer, because then it's 3 months, then it's 6 months, then it's 9 months, and you expand that time, and that's your goal. If you can do that, you're making a difference, because then it's a year, then it's 2 years, then it's 5 years, and you're working towards a longer term goal. But I did see other staff and other people in other organizations go, I helped you. Why are you back here? Like, aren't you good now? And it's like, no, you're going to fall down. We all fall down.
Well, that's right. And we can fall down again and again. And that's kind of when I was younger, and kind of that insight, because I screwed up a lot and again. And I, thank you, people who continue to love me. And that's what I love about James. It's that, those people it can be, there's no limit to how many times they can, go back to being on the downtown east side. It's that, just as your person said, we just want to make those longer, those times longer in between them going back, because it's when they're ready to heal and we meet them wherever they're at. And those are the kinds of organizations and the kind of work that we want to be involved in, whether it's industry, whether it's government, that they're, when people hire us or people know that they've worked with impact resolutions, that there's an expectation of how things have been done, that they can feel confident that there was, to go above and beyond FPIC, to really kind of really understand and support the mechanisms of which people really need to heal with, right? Like, I kind of think of, if we're really trying to our target audiences, drug war dismantlers, land defenders, it's like, those are the people we want to work with, who are really trying to do something different that actually works for people versus what's going to help them.
Right. Can you, you don't have to give like a direct example, but can you give us an example of you meet with a community and you say, hey, let's try and work together. We'll try and get some funding. What's the goals that you guys are kind of setting together in terms of getting funding? Then we're going to do X, Y, and Z. What are those kind of things that you're working on?
Well, I think it's not a cold call. It's usually people who know us already. Like, for instance, with the All Nations Outreach Society, I'd already been working with them for a little bit, and being able to put in-kind support from team members to then work with them to develop applications for funding that keeps them operating. and then also able to pay ourselves. So that's sort of one example. Part of this, I hope that message is out there. Contact us. We want to hear your stories, what's going on, because we're certainly not traditional in the way that we see how things should be run. And potentially we can work together once you get to know us as well. And I think that's where team members have been able to make those introductions through working relationships they've already had with previous careers or previous work experiences. So that's where we build it. Murray just has a reputation on its own, and he's just so well renowned in our field that people come to us because they know Murray. So that's one facet as well. But I also create incentives for members where they're going to get a commission off that first opportunity.
Interesting. So I'm looking long-term potentially to work with my community,
Right.
Tawathil First Nation.
That's right. Yeah.
And they're asking me to join their economic development committee, and they've asked if I'd be interested or open to the idea of running for chief and council
Right, yeah.
this coming June. I'm open to the idea. I'd much rather be part of an economic development corporation, because that's where I feel I don't really want to do the politics.
That's where the work
thrive.
really shines and lives. Like,
Yeah.
I've worked with some really great economic development arms who do and continue to do so, who do some really great things for the community in terms of raising capital. And that's what I get to learn from Murray too, raising capital. And we work together on how that can be reinvested back into the community. So that's actually we do that exact kind of work with One Nation in the North right now, raising that fund through the economic development arm, and then creating an organizational framework to make sure the needs of the community are met by talking to the right people, not only on staff, but with those committees that make up community members.
Right. So if I were to call and say, hey, we're ready to get started on
Yeah,
economic
give me a
development,
call,
what would
yeah.
that conversation sort of look like?
Right. Oh, with impact resolution.
Yeah, so we're ready to
Yeah.
get the ball rolling, but we want to do things ethically and make
Right.
sure we're lifting up and building capacity within our community. I think that's where perhaps if I hadn't have done this paper, I would have thought, no need for community consultation. I'll just hit the ground running. We'll get some business in here.
Yeah.
So what would that conversation sort of look
I
like?
would probably ask if, sort of what community plans have been done recently, what are about to be updated. Has there been a needs assessment? That could have been triggered by, sort of industry wanting to operate in that area. So that would be sort of some bite-sized pieces around a needs assessment. What's your communications plan? How do you know what you know is what you know, right? Like, are you in treaty? Are you not in treaty? Are you doing a relationship agreement? So it's really kind of understanding potentially what community pieces have already been explored or discovered or are wanting to, and then working backwards. Well, let's do a needs assessment. And then that kind of ding, ding, okay, we know what funding to apply for, if that's, and then how it might build into sort of later phases of funding that includes a communication plan, or maybe that's done simultaneously. But really, it's a conversation that starts, and trying to understand for myself, how much practice have you had working as a community is kind of the question I have in my mind, whether that's through treaty or community plans or et cetera.
That's incredible, because that's what my hope is to start working on that. And I know that it's going to cause a lot of disagreement in the outset. We're going to be airing dirty laundry in those early phases of, I didn't like how this was done 15 years ago.
And that's okay. You kind of got to get all that out. Like, that's really important, because it's like it's a pressure lid, and then it booms. So, like, again, it's sort of that needs assessment. It's kind of understanding all the things that need to be addressed. And the communication plan kind of ensures the governance around ensuring people don't get to that point.
Yeah. And then you get kind of part of that out of the way, because what happens, I think, is if you avoid that and you go, we'll just not do that, because why would we air our dirty laundry? Leaks into business agreements, and people start having
elections, all of that. And, you could have a hybrid system, a hereditary and an elected system. I wouldn't know, right? But it's sort of, maybe that's something that, having something that the community can focus on that brings love back into the community, and practicing on how to communicate with each other is really my goal. And we can find that with available funding out there under the guise of, economic development. But really, it should serve multiple purposes in my mind.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that that's something that when you're kind of in a cycle of poverty or you're used to the same old,
it's easy.
Yeah, I see it because I'm not on Chief and Council, thank goodness, right now, because I see those shots being taken of like, oh, you're getting rich off of this. And it's like, Chief and Council make about $1,000 a month. Like, you're not getting rich off of doing this job.
That's right. But then that goes down to a lack of communication, right? Or awareness. And that's kind of the work that I'd like to think I'm doing with the Indigenous Centre for Cumulative Effects, is, again, positioning communities to have that understanding before it's triggered by outsiders. Because once it's triggered, that is only going to be amplified. All these, like, why are you talking to that person? And that creates such an environment of unsafety, and that's the scary space that happened in the North, to be quite frank, and where it's gotten sort of out of control. People don't feel safe there anymore.
That's awful.
It is awful. And I don't think it needed to go there. I think there was another way to do that. And there was a lot of missed opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that when you have people like yourself who are willing to, I also interviewed Nook Crawford, and one of the things she commented on, because she's a family lawyer, and so she gets those.
Oh, she gets it all.
Yeah, and she gets to see that, and so trying to have a calm person in the room to break things down and like, okay, like we hear what you're saying, and like there is this space to talk, but we need to make sure we're still being constructive and working towards some sort of goal. Like, I feel
being
like
that sort of, it's mediator. Mediator might be the right term, but it's emotional. A mediator who is neutral and trusted on all sides. That's kind of, the key point. And, the work that we do is sort of, if there might be people already existing in the community who just needs a bit of training and confidence to know that they continue that work. Like our position is, we want to work ourselves out of a job.
Yeah.
We don't want to be here forever. This is not, it's really just to kind of, again, going back to what Helen said, share what we know and provide them the support until they're ready to take that on their own.
It's just funny that you say that, because that's how I feel about taking on a role, because I do feel mostly disconnected from my community, that I don't have any opinions on what correct development needs to be. So whatever the community chooses, I don't have a team I'm on where it's like, I want it to look like X. And so I feel like I can be helpful all the way up until somebody else is ready to lead the way on what they truly believe their community needs to look like, because I don't live there. I'm not going to, if we put in a pipeline, or if we start logging more, or if we put up a big gas station, I'm not going to be there using that service anyways. So whatever all of you want is what I want for you, so that you can fill the jobs that interest you.
And that's where the needs assessment comes in, to depoliticize sort of action plans or next steps for people, for everybody, right? It's sort of, the work to get there and to the outcomes of what those needs are, again, is practicing on how to collaborate. And with those who live on reserve and off reserve.
Yeah.
Right?
What advice would you give? Because it sounds like a tool that everybody could use more of, an ability to relate to, oh, I hear your side, I hear this side, and recognizing and having those conversations. It's a built skill that I feel like we're starting to see the value in, but it's still in those very nascent stages.
It's interesting that you say that. We just came off a project where we're supporting Muslim youth serving organization actually provide, appropriate and sort of culturally relevant support. And the first question kind of have to ask yourself, have you included youth in the decision making? Have you included youth in sort of the idea of the programming? And that's, it seems common sense, but it's an important question to ask. Have you included community members? Who have you included as community members? And how were these consultations run? Like, it's good to have a facilitator, a neutral facilitator, because it doesn't have to be long and drawn out. For me, it's 4 sessions. You should have enough information. The first 2, just everyone being able to air out they're, sort of identify the issues and vulnerabilities, pivoting in the third one to, co-collaborating on solutions. That's where the real magic happens, right? And that's it. It's really a well-being based, strength-based, trauma-informed, community-centered approach. Really, that's kind of, how we see engagement, whether it's with industry or community programs or sort of nonprofits. That's kind of the formula in my mind.
I love that last part because that's where people start to see themselves as the solution.
Yeah.
And I think that's what maybe it felt like that's what's been missing from conversations when I was a court worker, was that and of course I believe that there's been atrocities against Indigenous people, but there's this instinct to go, this isn't my fault because of Indian residential schools. And I think that limits our ability to see ourselves as the potential solutions to the challenges that we're facing. And I think I feel like that's inspirational, and I feel like it just needs to be said more.
It's the pain, turning that pain into purpose. And some people just have never been asked. Like, it's disgusting. Like, when I go into a place, it's like, did you even talk to them? It's like, what? You've been texting them. That's how you think a relationship. No. Like, and that's it. Like, people just sort of don't even know something about themselves until they're asked to participate. And that's it. You can only just give the opportunity. You can't force people into it. But once you create that safe space, they're going to tell us more people. They're going to tell more people. And then it's, again, practice, right?
And then they integrate it into themselves, and then they're excited about the solution. Yeah,
you're creating champions. And that's kind of, the involuntary resettlement work. For me, that's sort of this idea, or the sort of the fault of previous assessments, is those who were involuntarily resettled weren't sort of taking ownership of those plans. Well, of course they're not. They were not anywhere near the they were not able to make any decisions about it. They're not inspired. It's someone else's plan that was imposed upon them. Of course they're not. So that's kind of where I got that training and that insight to, like, it's not even, like, I think other people do. I think the confidence that it's the right sort of start. It's the right place to start.
Yeah, that it's the cornerstone of how to move forward is by building up the community so that they can, in the future, come to
weather any storms.
Yeah.
They can weather anything. I really believe that. I know it. That's where, sustainable ecocultural tourism for me, whether it's here in Canada or elsewhere, whatever the outcome, it might be tourism, but at least we're leaving a legacy. They have clean water, wastewater treatment, housing. It's just like, that's the legacy I want to leave.
Sorry, could you tell people what that is? It's a very long word. Sustainable
ecocultural tourism.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like that idea, like that's kind of the guiding principles, right? And that might be the outcome that our journey gets us to, but it's an option only after we're going to a community, meeting them where they're at. So just like anything else, assessing what they want, and then building the infrastructure. Usually it starts with community infrastructure, wastewater treatment, all that sort of good water, like those things that you would expect, food, that building them up and we're working with community members and community leaders to, raise the funds to get them there. But ecotourism might be the outcome, but it doesn't have to be, but our entry point for conversation is tourism.
That is very interesting. Can you explain why tourism is one of the cornerstones? Because I agree with you. I just think it would be valuable to kind of sift that out.
For me, it sort of goes back to the sustainability. People want to visit and share and build. I don't know. For me, it's just sort of being able to invite visitors in an area that you're really proud of gives you such a sense of, I don't know, just pride. Like it's nice, like cleaning my apartment and having people over. I have a huge sense of pride in that. Like, it's like, yeah, I cleaned it. It's like, I'm proud of you, want to share it. And I think tourism for me kind of generates a potential and really kind of builds that solidarity, because we hear stuff and again, it's the news. Like I always want to be there and go there and listen for myself. And I think creating tourism opportunities for me kind of generates the right sort of momentum, Like I've visited areas that you see on the news that are war torn, and I have such a different perception of those areas. I think that's where we can really take advantage of, I guess, as an excuse to collaborate.
Can I just ask your thoughts on the news from your perspective? Because we saw Wet'suwet'en on the news, you got to work with them. We see perhaps Pakistan or countries near there in dire states of affair, and we develop our perceptions often based on our understanding of what's going on our news cycle.
Yeah.
And if there's anything that hopefully we're starting to develop is to ask more, better, higher quality questions and to really reflect on what I had Geetanjali Gill on.
That's right.
And she's very interested in working with, I think she's a part of a project right now trying to make sure that education is accessible to women in other countries. And she's a practitioner as well. And one of her comments was like, there's so many amazing things going on in other countries, but it never makes our news. And it was just that's so crazy that's a problem that we haven't looked into solving. And I was advocating for her, and I'm probably going to advocate for you to consider doing like an update on what's going on around the world that's good new or information that we should be championing and be proud of and give us a different perspective on these countries. Because if you asked me to go to Pakistan, I'd be like, is it safe? And like that's a naive question from somebody who doesn't know.
It's a fair question, right? And I think of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and when I was there just last in 2020, and you see, using the pandemic as an example, and you didn't hear about this in the news. The first thing the Prime Minister did was develop areas for the poor and homeless to be safe and taken care of in this pandemic. That was the first thing that he did. Like out of anything, he shut the country down. He made, he just made it, gave the structure the people needed in what potentially could have been a panic situation. We were traveling on our way up to northern Pakistan on the Chinese-Pakistan border. We had to come back early, and that's when I had this opportunity to visit Peshawar on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border and go into Afghanistan. And these are areas, 10, 15 years ago that were constantly being bombed that you would see in the news. And such a different perspective for me. People would look at me, obviously I'm not from there, and they would smile. They felt like there was this hope that, they were able to finally move back into their communities. Like there was peace in that region again. So I certainly, for me, it just sort of reinforced again how important it is to visit and kind of spread that awareness that it might be different from what you're used to, but it doesn't mean it's wrong.
Did you have any reaction to what happened with the troops pulling out?
I did. The first thing was phone my colleagues. How's it going? And I know I don't want to talk too much because I know I have colleagues who had a very, who were there at that time and had some horrible things happen to them. So I know nothing is so
black and
white. I get that. But their perception was so different. Like there was a sense of celebration for them, and sort of hope at sort of that U.S. withdrawal at the same time that was happening. So I was hearing many different things, and my experiences are kind of based on my own. But I've just been given so many reasons to know how important it is to be there, to really understand it, or have, how important it is to visit those regions before having an opinion.
That's what I think is the most interesting, right? Is people have all types of opinions on good withdrawal, bad withdrawal, what should have been done better, and they never went.
Yeah, or they base their whole careers on an idea that they've actually never been there. Yeah. That's it. Just kind of wow. I think if we can kind of bring it back to the basics, I think there's some hope. For us.
I definitely feel that way in regards to Indigenous issues. I just think it's discouraging when, from my perspective, your leader perhaps goes to Tofino and goes and relies. Like that doesn't inspire confidence.
It doesn't. And that's the thing is sort of, well, what is leadership? Is it just one person? Is that one person? Is that reasonable to expect they should shoulder and burden all of that responsibility? When there's so many different kinds of governance and leadership styles, right? Or, Yeah, I don't know. And I think that's a community by community decision.
And that recognition that there is a whole minister responsible, and like we didn't focus on what they're doing, and that's where I think it gets easy to pick sides or to politicize issues and pick one side or the other. And I think that that's where there's value in like trying to understand deeper, trying to hear people out.
Spend that time because and it might feel like a lot of work if but just like for anything, you have the right tools, the right people in place, do that early work early, meaningfully will just save you, it'll just set you up better for things that are and just make things more, people more feel like they have more ownership of the process. Yeah.
Can you tell us, we have gone through a lot of your career, but we were talking about your nonprofit earlier.
Right.
Can you tell us where it's at today?
I wish it's kind of blended in with impact resolutions work. So I haven't actually utilized the nonprofit versus sort of next plans to work with the communities. I still communicate with the communities that I worked with back in those days. They had a horrible fire, and I don't have to raise the money. I can usually take the money more on a personal level. I don't have to have big fundraisers, which I would love to do, sort of going down. But I continue to sort of keep in touch and would like, and actually have one member. And she was 9 or 6 at the time when I was working there. She's now a young adult. She wants to be a civil engineer, and she's actually one of our members to gain work experience on our team. So really remarkable. We're starting a bit of a, I guess, sort of the work that we're involved in that's related to the nonprofit, 10 years after the dam has essentially abandoned any social responsibility. What is life really like? Because we don't often hear the stories of the people when they're not involved anymore. And I think it's a critical moment that they probably need to get off their chest. So we're starting that conversation and that work.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Like it's, we make these decisions around resettlement action plans and but how does it actually operate? Like, so, 20 years after construction, I fail to see the benefits, even though there's such a, I fail to see the benefits for those early decisions that were made back then. I see hope in the future, but hopefully this work can help inform sort of future resettlement action plans.
Yeah, I think that's the tough part, right? Is that it's on our news cycle or it's in our minds at the front end. And then looking back on, like when you think of the politicization of the U.S.'s healthcare system, and then you see now it's not even a topic, but it was the primary talking point for almost a year of just talking only about, well, I would do healthcare this way or that way, and I disagree with this person's approach on that. And then it's like, well, none of you are doing anything. Like, what are we doing? Like,
professional talkers. Professional self-promoters. That's the expertise we've created in our society now, and people make a lot of money doing that. And it's sort of, for me, I think if they use those skills that had some reciprocity going back into, the communities they supposedly serve, wow, what magic that would happen, right? So, I hear you. It's sort of news cycles and what seems sort of important should always be important, especially for those people who don't have access to the media like you and me.
Exactly. The person who connected us is actually Mark Lalonde.
That's right. Yeah.
So if we don't have a chance to talk about him, I'll be disappointed.
I was going to say another, a dear friend and another Mark is just not only just a great friend, but he's super energizing. I feel really safe with him to, kind of have these kinds of discussions about the what ifs. And I would say a mentor too.
How did you meet Mark? Mark was actually, for listeners who don't know, he was actually a past podcast guest.
That's right. Yeah. We met actually with a colleague of his, Royston, and Royston and I worked in the field together. He's corporate security for Coastal GasLink at the time. So this is back in 2014, 2015. And basically Royston's role is to ensure the safety of the environmental field teams. And there were 150 plus 80 Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, elders, and youth with us, all collecting environmental information at once. So Royston and I were leading those programs. And I met Mark through Royston at an event that their company was hosting. We just became fast friends after that, and always made an effort to connect when we're in town at the same time. Actually, Mark was the first to introduce me to Abbotsford a few years ago. It was sad because I moved to Abbotsford and then he moved to Sunderland. So, but that's how I discovered or started to explore the Fraser Valley.
Amazing, because I took his class. And
okay, I did some teaching. I taught it at a few sort of special courses with him, of course.
Yeah,
Yes.
and so he was kind of the first to be like, we don't have the answers, and these are global problems. And I was like, hey, I'm here for you to tell me what the solutions to these problems are. And he gave us an assignment. He's like, write about a problem and all the different aspects of that problem. And so I think I did, the main one was like water and like rising water. And it's like, it's a complex problem. It's impacting different communities completely differently, some for the better, some for the worse. Who takes responsibility? Who's accountable for when water is rising? And how do we hold them accountable if we like, and it's so complicated, but that was his kind of approach, is just like find a problem and talk about all the problems with that problem.
Well, and it's so overwhelming. And that's where when we're talking right now, it's like, where do you start? If we haven't started with what I think is A and B or C, which is people and the people who might be sort of immediately impacted, then we've gone too far. Yeah. And that's sort of where I feel I have something special to contribute to the world or to the people I work with is that intimate understanding based on our whole selves.
That's amazing. Yeah. For somebody who's interested in working with you, they've listened to this and they've gotten this far, what would you say to them in terms of your perhaps an elevator pitch or your idea of what impact resolutions is bringing about?
Yeah, thank you. I think it, honestly, as a team, we're building a safe space for people to explore the what ifs, the possibilities, and the potential of what that mutual sort of reciprocal relationship between industry and community and everything can offer by having the right information. So I encourage you, reach out. Love to hear more about you. And many people have. A lot of people have found my profile online and introduced themselves. And it always because that's how I used to do things when I was younger. Just pick up the phone and ask me a question. That's how I certainly started off in my career.
That was actually my next question was going to be, you set such a strong example in being willing to persevere and willing to take risks. Like for many, starting a business is a very intimidating process. For many, starting a nonprofit organization is a very intimidating process. Traveling the world, intimidating process. Leaving when you did, brave decision. And so I think that you set such a strong example in willing to say, I'm going to move forward and I'm going to put a smile on my face and persevere. And I think that so many people get stuck, and there's like a good quote of so many people live quiet lives of lives of quiet desperation, of wishing they had, of saying I could have done that maybe.
That's suffering. Yeah. That's suffering, and it goes back to having the space to daydream and explore those what ifs. And I feel so excited through impact resolutions that I get to with such a brilliant, passionate, enthusiastic group of people who believe that too. And it's not to say we're disregarding the greater good for our own personal needs. Those can be met too. That's why I think I started Impact Resolutions as a for-profit, because I think when I was younger, it's sort of, you forget about that. And thank goodness Murray, who reminds me we need to make profit too. And that's the thing I'm learning. But yeah, it's, I don't think we need to suffer. I think there are ways and questions that we can ask ourselves to at least start with the right step.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think profit is a tough, when you're a genuine person, it feels like profit is
It's so
selfish.
wrong, exactly.
And so it's something that I've thought about too, because it's like, well, I want to work hard, set a good example, but I want to make sure that I'm passing, like my community doesn't have
Yeah.
wealth to pass on.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
if we're not looking at having enough wealth that we can donate to good causes, where we can say, like one of my role models, and I think he's made a few mistakes more recently, but it's Naval Ravikant, if you've ever heard of him. He's an investor. He helped start Facebook.
Okay, yeah.
And one of the comments he made was like, go get the money. Like you can't, like the people who have bad ideologies, who are selfish, who are
They get the money.
and then they go influence things by buying a building and saying, we're going to put this business in there. And they go make more money and they continue to grow that. And so if you're saying I'm idealistic and I'm not going to participate in that system, then they're going to go have their influence. And that's what I always try and consider when I'm talking about Indigenous communities is either a corporation's going to come in and tell us what they're going to do, or we're going to say, actually, we're already investing in doing X, Y, and Z.
Exactly.
So
we don't need you.
Yeah.
Right? And that kind of goes, I couldn't agree more. And that's the thing I had to kind of contend with in my university days, working for, World Bank projects, those, in that context, I was constantly you're selling out. And I had to really contend, no, this is important. I'd rather be there, and knowing that I care to do the right thing than some other person who might not care as much. And that's one way I rationalize it. In business, I need to remind myself of that too. And that's sort of where, in building the company, ensuring that the team is taken care of first, I finally in a position where I can take care of myself now. And I know that for me is sort of like, that's a success moving in the right direction, and then hopefully I'll get to that time where I can, step away and someone could walk into my shoes to take it over. Like I'm constantly thinking of that. So I can take this profit and invest it somewhere, because that's important to me. That makes me happy.
Yeah, I feel the same way about the podcast. When I started this, I was like, I'm not going to do this role forever. I might continue to have conversations, but this has brought me such benefit in terms of building relationships with people, networking, learning more about people's stories, that it would be perhaps selfish of me to just think, oh, when I'm done, this disappears and this platform's gone.
That's right. It's sort of a legacy that you can pass on.
Yeah.
It's a different way of thinking that I think we're not naturally sort of inclined to think that way. So I think that those small pivots will really make a difference.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that it's inspirational to think I'm building something to pass on rather than this is just about me and my success.
Totally. I'm excited for you. This is great. And just some of your great announcements recently with Chilliwack Tourism. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I am very excited about that opportunity. Can you tell people how they can connect with you online, your website, your social media pages?
Thank you. I'm on LinkedIn, Pepita Elena McKee. I can be reached at www.impactresolutions.ca.
Amazing. And I think you're also on Twitter, if I'm not mistaken.
Not actively, no. I would say. LinkedIn is probably the space we're more active. Facebook is where a lot of our friends, our colleagues, our clients sort of live and operate. So Facebook is another page that we have. We have an Instagram page, but I think LinkedIn and Facebook is probably the most active.
Amazing. Pepita, I am so grateful to have had the opportunity to hear about the journey that you've been on. I think that you should have your own movie based on like the amount of struggle you faced early on and your willingness to push forward and not listen to the naysayers, not listen to how other people define you. I think that it's easy for all of us to fall into how other people perceive us, and for your willingness to leave that circumstance. We don't know what could have happened. If you hadn't have chosen to do that, you might not have been here today to share such an inspirational story. And your willingness to see both sides, I think, is another area where there's so much to learn from that, because it's so easy to judge someone based on a clickbait headline or on an assumption rather than going, well, this perhaps this corporation is working to try and make money and take care of their shareholders, and this community is working to try and take care of their community, and they both have perspectives. And I think that balance is so important, because I believe in like the rights of people to protest, but I want it to be informed, and I want it to be understood that there's so much nuance to these conversations. And I think that we should enjoy that rather than flee from it. And I think that that's the example that you set by saying this is a long process and we're going to go through it together, but at the end, everybody's going to flourish. And I think that that's what I want people to understand about Indigenous communities, is if we don't develop, you miss out on our culture, our language, our food, like our stories, our history.
A missed opportunity not to, right?
Exactly.
No, thank you, Aaron, for giving me this platform. I'm really honored to be able to share my story in such a safe environment, and you made it really easy to share. I want to say, yes, thank you for this opportunity, Aaron, so much.
Yes, I heard that you had perhaps a more difficult experience previously, and I hope that this was more positive and more impactful. So
it was, yeah, thank you. I feel like all the work that you did in advance and just the environment that you've created here. Thank you.
Well, it's such an honor to be able to sit down with people like yourself and hear such an important story. And I'm always learning more. Like, I had no idea what was going on in Pakistan. And so I take those stories with me and talk about them in the future, because I enjoy understanding and learning from your experiences. And I think that that's something we don't do perhaps enough, is that we go, well, like maybe there's something to learn from this person's years of life experience.
That's right. Well, I don't want the conversation to stop here, Aaron. Always feel welcome to reach out as a sounding board and brainstorm anytime.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Pepita.
Thank you, Aaron.